Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different, a little squirmy, a little, wait, are we really doing this? But yes, we absolutely are. Because there's this thing we all share, even if we don't talk about it the same way. History, desire, power, and the way those things have collided in, well, let's just say very uncomfortable ways. This is the story of sex, not the playful kind in pop songs or the sanitized health class version. This is the raw, messy, unfiltered history of how humans have used, abused, and politicized sex since the dawn of time. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this emotionally unscathed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I know this topic might not be everyone's cup of herbal sleepy time tea, but if it makes you go, huh, that's messed up, or even just, wow, people were weird, then yeah, we're vibing. Also, tell me your city and time down in the comments. Let's see where and when this hits you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So here it is. The truth no one really wants to hear. History didn't just happen through battles and treaties. No, a whole lot of it happened between bed sheets, in alleyways, behind closed palace doors, and yes, in ways that will absolutely make your skin crawl. This isn't just about desire. It's about control, survival, ownership, and sometimes terrifying silence. The thing is, we like to imagine ourselves as evolved. We use euphemisms like making love and adult content, and we pretend that we're way past the awkward, uncomfortable entanglements of our ancestors. But here's the first bitter pill to swallow. We're not. We've just found new ways to hide the same old dynamics, and if you zoom out far enough, the patterns become hard to ignore. Let's rewind to the most primal version of humanity, prehistoric times. Even back then, sex was never just about pleasure. It was a survival tool. You're hungry, you're cold, you're alone in the middle of a saber-toothed winter. Then mating wasn't just instinct, it was strategy. And because human babies are, well, ridiculously fragile and need like 2 decades to become semi-independent, 6 had to come with strings attached. It became bargaining power, it became leverage, and, spoiler alert, it became something people used to get ahead, or just to stay alive. Now what makes this truth really uncomfortable isn't just the biology, it's how people learned to control it. As early human groups grew into tribes and villages, someone always ended up in charge. And what do people in charge usually do? They control resources, including, brace yourself, the reproductive ones. It sounds awful, and that's because it was. Women's bodies became part of the economy. If you had a daughter, you could trade her for livestock, land, or political alliances. If you were a woman without protection, you became vulnerable to predation in every possible sense of the word. Here's your historical fact for tonight. In some early Mesopotamian city-states, legal codes included clauses about sexual transactions, virginity checks, and even temple sex work, which was often more ritualistic than voluntary. These weren't side issues, they were foundational parts of the economy and religion. That's how deep it went. And here's your quirky fringe fact. One of the oldest pieces of erotica ever found is over 4,000 years old, etched onto a piece of clay from ancient Sumer. It features a graphic sex scene between a goddess and a shepherd, used as a fertility blessing. So yeah, while we were still figuring out farming, we were already leaving behind fanfic. But here's where the real discomfort sets in. Scholars still can't agree on what parts of early sexual culture were empowering, and what parts were pure exploitation. Was ritual sex in temples a form of sacred feminine power? Or was it just a socially sanctioned way to control women's bodies under the guise of religion? That debate rages on, and probably will forever. And honestly, you feel that tension, don't you? That push and pull between reverence and revulsion. That's not new. Humans have always been kind of obsessed and horrified by sex at the same time. We worship fertility goddesses, then punish women for showing skin. We paint erotic art on walls, then call it immoral. It's as if we've never fully made peace with the fact that our entire species is built on this weird, chaotic, emotional act, and we just keep rebranding it every few centuries to make ourselves feel better. You imagine the first moments of this awkward history being filled with wild abandon, but the truth is probably more tragic. There wasn't a lot of romance. There were more transactions, less pillow talk, more survival negotiations. the kind of silence that settles in when no one wants to admit the rules are rigged. You might be picturing two people sneaking off behind a cave for a moonlit cuddle, but chances are higher it was an older man claiming a girl after a successful hunt, with her having zero say in the matter. Yeah, told you this wouldn't be comfortable. But here's where we start to understand why knowing this matters. Because even today, you still see echoes of those ancient arrangements in how we talk about relationships, about power, about who gets to want and who's supposed to wait. Those dynamics didn't vanish, they evolved. They got legal names, they got Instagram filters, but the tension, the trade, the imbalance, still here, still lurking in contracts and culture, in the way we shame some people and silence others. And don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. Across time there have been stories of resistance, of radical love, of people turning the system on its head. We'll get to those. But to appreciate how brave those rebels were, you have to first understand how suffocating the norm was. So tonight, just let that settle. The idea that from the very start sex wasn't free love. It was structured, owned, brokered, feared. And most of all, it was rarely about pleasure. Not at first. It was about who got to survive and what price they had to pay. Now exhale. Maybe sip some water. We've only just begun. Let's keep going, because things are about to get even less romantic. You're walking through a dusty cave somewhere in France. Chauvet, maybe, or Lascaux. You've got a torch in your hand, flickering light against the stone, casting shadows over paintings older than agriculture. Deer, bison, handprints. And then, bam! There it is. A crude but unmistakable depiction of human figures, not just hunting or dancing, but engaging, in ways that leave little to the imagination. So yeah, prehistoric cave art wasn't all animals and spirits. Some of it was unapologetically sexual. And no, it wasn't vandalism by some bored teenager of the Ice Age. These images had meaning. They told stories, recorded rituals, and, most awkwardly, captured the early human obsession with reproduction and fertility. Because when life is short, cold, and brutal, the next generation isn't just a family matter, it's survival. You imagine that first flick of ochre on limestone, maybe someone painting their version of a love story, or more likely, a visual guide to the ritual of life itself. The artists weren't just expressing themselves, they were documenting, recording, or warning. That's still up for debate. Here's your historical fact. In the Upper Paleolithic period, figures like the Venus of Willendorf, a small carved statuette with exaggerated curves, were created all over Europe. These weren't pornographic in the modern sense, but they were absolutely about fertility. Big hips, big breasts, no face, a symbol, not a person. A womb with legs, basically. And these figurines weren't rare, they were everywhere. Found buried in homes, near hearths, sometimes in graves. Fertility was the obsession, and women's bodies were turned into icons, which leads to your fringe fact of the night. In a cave called La Marche, in western France, archaeologists found depictions of humans with tattoos, hairstyles, and yes, full nudity, including arousal. Some researchers claim these are among the first attempts at pornographic art. Others argue they're sacred, not sexual. But either way, they're old. Really old. And extremely detailed. Imagine being 15,000 years deep into the past and still sketching sexy stick figures. Humanity never changes. But here's the uncomfortable twist. These depictions didn't show intimacy in the way we think of it now. There's no indication of mutual affection. No emotional narrative. These weren't love letters. They were diagrams. Maybe guides. Maybe warnings, and scholars have long debated what these images were really for. Was this prehistoric sex ed, ritual magic, a way to manifest abundance? Or were these early humans just as confused, just as curious, and just as horny as modern ones, but without a functioning therapist? And if you're hoping for some kind of prehistoric sexual utopia, stop. The past doesn't care about your modern ideals. Back then, survival came first. Pairing off had less to do with emotional compatibility and more to do with who could carry wood and not die of exposure. Consent as a concept probably didn't exist the way it does now. There were power dynamics, even in the caves. Older males held social dominance. Young girls were often bartered like any other resource. And pleasure, that wasn't really the point. Reproduction was. You want to feel optimistic, to believe that early humans must have had moments of tenderness, of true connection. And maybe they did. But those moments weren't what got carved into stone or moulded into clay. What survived was utility, symbolism, control, and that's telling. Imagine the scene. A small band of people huddled around a fire, meat roasting. Someone starts telling a story, maybe about the moon, maybe about a spirit that brings children. They pass around a figurine, round and smooth, polished by generations of hands. It's not just a statue, it's a prayer, a plea, a hope that their daughters will bear healthy children, that the tribe won't vanish, that the winter won't take everyone. But also, maybe someone in that group knows exactly how unfair it all is. Maybe she knows she doesn't get a choice, that she'll be given to the best hunter, or the man with the biggest spear, or whoever the elders choose. Maybe she doesn't want children. Maybe she wants the girl who skins rabbits faster than anyone else. But there's no room for that in the story. Not yet. And so the art continues. Carved, painted, whispered. Always with the same themes. Fertility, power, and the unspoken price of survival. One of the biggest scholarly debates about this era is whether these early expressions of sexuality were celebratory or coercive. Some anthropologists argue that these rituals and artworks show a society more connected to the body, more accepting of difference, and even more egalitarian in gender roles. Others counter that the dominance of fertility symbols and the near erasure of individuality in female forms suggest a deeply patriarchal mindset, one where women were valued only for their reproductive potential. So which is it? Utopia or dystopia? The answer, as usual, is probably somewhere in the messy middle. Tonight you're sitting with that ambiguity. You're breathing it in like cave dust. Because even here, before writing, before kingdoms, before war, sex was never just sex. It was belief. It was fear. It was leverage. And while we might not fully understand the minds behind those painted walls, we can feel the weight of what they left behind. The funny thing is, you know these people. You've met them. The guy who draws weird stuff when he's bored. The one who turns everything into a ritual. The elder who makes the rules no one questions. The girl with too much awareness and nowhere to put it. These aren't strangers. They're just you before Wi-Fi, with mammoth furs instead of hoodies. And deep down, they're struggling with the same questions. Who gets to choose? Who gets seen? Who gets remembered? So when you hear people say things like sex has always been natural, remember that natural doesn't always mean good, or fair, or free. Sometimes it just means it's been part of the human struggle since the first fire was lit. And that's where we leave it tonight. In a cave, surrounded by flickering shadows of things too complicated to name. They tried to draw it, to mould it, to make sense of it, and in doing so they left us a breadcrumb trail of discomfort we're still following. Now that you've adjusted to the dim light of prehistory and its awkward carvings, let's step into the next evolutionary phase, where people began trading more than just furs and flint tools. Yep, things are about to get transactional, because as soon as human beings figured out how to plant stuff and settle down, they also figured out how to turn sex into an economy. Welcome to the age when bodies officially became currency. It starts with agriculture. Seems harmless, right? Just wheat and goats. But farming changed everything. Once humans stopped roaming and started hoarding resources, suddenly not everyone was equal anymore. Landowners were kings, food was power, and people, especially women, became assets to be bartered, traded, married off, or used to seal deals between families. It was no longer just about surviving the night. It was about building legacies and maintaining control over who got to have what, including whom. You can almost hear the shift, can't you? The clink of the first clay tokens, the first arguments over whose sheep are fatter, and somewhere, a father saying to his neighbour, "You can have my daughter if I get the North Field." Romantic. Here's your historical fact. In ancient Sumer, some of the earliest written laws, carved in cuneiform on stone tablets, included detailed clauses about sexual behaviour, marriage contracts, and even the penalties for adultery. And those rules weren't about love. They were about property rights. Husbands could sell their wives into slavery to pay debts. Daughters could be given to temples for ritual servitude, often involving sexual rights. It wasn't personal, it was business. Your fringe fact. In Babylon there's a claim, controversial but persistent, that every woman was once expected to sit outside a temple and offer herself to a stranger in the name of the goddess Ishtar. Scholars argue over whether this was real or misinterpreted by early Greek travellers who didn't quite get Mesopotamian religious customs. Still, the idea that sex could be sacred and compulsory at the same time is one of history's weirdest balancing acts. Now pause and think about what that means. Sex, something deeply intimate, being used as a currency of obligation. You didn't do it because you wanted to. You did it because the harvest was short, or your family owed a debt, or the gods needed appeasing. And if you were born into the wrong body, too female, too poor, too powerless, you had no say. Your agency? Gone. Your desire? Irrelevant. It's a sharp turn from the cave paintings where things were weird but at least a little anonymous. This was institutional. You'd think that kind of control would make people more discreet, but no. Entire religious and legal systems were built around managing sex. Virginity became a commodity. Purity was something a father could guard, like gold. Not because he loved his daughter, but because she represented value. An untouched daughter could be married off for more grain, more goats, more influence. The female body wasn't just policed, it was priced. Yeah, and don't get too comfortable imagining the men as being all-powerful and joyful in this setup either. They had rules too, lots of them, especially if they were poor. Because while elite men could access slaves, concubines, or temple workers, the average farmer couldn't afford those privileges, so even desire became stratified. Another thing you could only fully experience if you were rich. Great. This is where the first organised sex economies started to appear. Not hidden, not shameful, completely normalised. There were brothels with standardised rates, legal codes that listed where it was okay to go and who was allowed to be involved. Sex was taxed, regulated, embedded into the structure of ancient cities. It was as much a part of urban planning as aqueducts or market squares. But, and here's the debate, was it empowering for the women involved? Some scholars argue that sex workers in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt had more autonomy than we assume. They had guilds, wore specific clothing, even paid into early versions of social networks. Others argue this freedom was just another illusion of choice in a system designed by and for men. And honestly, you can feel the tension in both perspectives. Were they respected, or just tolerated because they served a function? Either way, the unspoken truth is this. Sex in early civilizations was rarely about intimacy. It was about strategy, about climbing a social ladder with rungs made of dowries, offspring and alliances. Love didn't enter the picture unless it conveniently aligned with your family's economic goals. And even then, it was the exception, not the rule. You picture a young girl, maybe 12 or 13, in a linen dress, hair braided tight by her mother, being led to a market square to meet the older man she's been promised to since she was a baby. She's never spoken to him. She doesn't get to say no. Her father negotiates while she stands quietly, eyes on the ground. This isn't a ceremony. It's a transaction, one that benefits everyone but her. Now zoom out. Multiply that scene by thousands, over centuries. Entire generations traded, married, assigned or sold, not just for love or even lust, but to keep dynasties running and fields ploughed. We like to think of human sexuality as deeply personal, but for most of history it was anything but. It was public, political, and very, very profitable. And if you're wondering where that leaves us today, well, you've seen the echoes. In modern wedding customs that still talk about giving away the bride, in debates about dowries and purity culture, in the very fact that sex even now is a trillion-dollar industry, and not all of it voluntary. So tonight, maybe sit with that discomfort. The idea that the thing we associate with love, passion, and connection has spent most of history as a commodity. Bought, sold, taxed, sanctified. Often with no room left for the people actually involved to have a say in how it all played out. Because if you thought sex was complicated now, try navigating it when your body is literally someone else's bargaining chip. You know what's wild? Virginity, this thing people still argue about, obsess over, make weird TikToks about, wasn't even originally about you, or your body, or your choices. It was invented, polished, and weaponized by men who wanted to lock down inheritance. That's it. That's the uncomfortable truth. Virginity didn't start as a moral ideal. It was a tracking system, a way for patriarchs to make sure the children their wives gave birth to were really theirs, not sacred, just surveillance. Let's rewind to when things got really official. Ancient laws, marriage contracts, and entire social structures began to circle, like vultures around this abstract idea. A woman untouched by any man except the one she'd be married to. Sound familiar? That's because it's stuck. So hard that even thousands of years later, we're still living with the residue. And what made it really effective was that it couldn't be seen. You couldn't prove virginity existed without inventing rituals to validate it. Suddenly there are wedding night bloodcloths, midwives inspecting girls, and entire households holding their breath outside a bedroom door, waiting to see if a woman's body confirms her worth. Seriously, people built ceremonies around this. Here's your historical fact. In ancient Hebrew tradition, if a man accused his new wife of not being a virgin, her family was required to provide physical proof, usually a stained bedsheet from the wedding night, to the town elders. If they couldn't, she could be stoned to death outside her father's house. That was written into law. No appeals, no leniency, just death, based on a rumour and a lack of red fabric. Now for your fringe fact, in medieval Europe, there was a bizarre belief that a virgin's touch could heal wounds or purify water, so naturally rich men started trying to bottle that myth, literally. In some alchemical traditions, a virgin's urine was considered a key ingredient in potions for eternal youth. No pressure, ladies. The thing is, the obsession with virginity didn't come from a place of spiritual reverence. It came from a place of property. Landowners, kings, tribal chiefs, they all had one terrifying anxiety in common. What if the heir isn't mine? What if the child I leave everything to is someone else's spawn? That fear led to rules, and those rules got coded into religion, into law, into culture. Virginity became a guarantee, except it wasn't. It never was. Human bodies don't come with tamper-proof seals, and let's talk about who didn't have to worry about any of this. Men. A guy could be on his 8th conquest before his beard fully came in, and no one blinked. In fact, he was applauded. But a woman who'd had even a whisper of experience? Damaged goods. That's how deep the double standard ran. It wasn't just encouraged, it was baked into the structure of entire civilizations. In ancient Greece, for example, women were expected to marry young, often right after puberty, and remain faithful for life. Their husbands, not so much. They could take lovers, visit brothels, and carry on with little consequence. And yet, if a woman so much as flirted too enthusiastically with the wrong man, her entire reputation was at risk. Even goddesses weren't safe. The myth of Persephone, literally about a young maiden abducted and assaulted by Hades, and somehow she's the one labelled impure afterward. Cool story, Zeus. The deeper you look, the worse it gets. Young girls were often inspected before marriage, and if they didn't pass the virginity test, whether physical or rumour-based, it could mean social exile, violence, or even death. Meanwhile, their brothers were being sent off to learn swordplay, diplomacy, and, let's be honest, how to brag about their own sexual exploits without any fear of punishment. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was control, plain and simple, and that's what's most uncomfortable here. Virginity became less about a person's experience and more about who got to decide their worth. Women didn't own their own stories. Their bodies were evidence in someone else's narrative. Fathers guarded it, husbands claimed it, priests preached about it, doctors studied it, but almost no one ever asked the girl. There's an old, ongoing scholarly debate about whether this rigid system actually protected women in certain societies, whether, ironically, these constraints provided a weird kind of stability. Some historians argue that in ancient Rome and feudal Japan, noble women used their purity as political leverage, buying themselves time, power, and better marriage options. Others say that's like putting lipstick on a cage. It wasn't empowerment, it was survival strategy in a rigged game. After all, calling something honour doesn't mean it's not also a prison. And while all this was happening, there were always the exceptions, the rebels, the ones who dared to defy the system and paid the price. Ancient poetry is full of women who fell in love outside of marriage, who took lovers in secret, who chose passion over reputation. Their stories usually ended badly, dead, exiled, or broken, but not erased. Somehow their voices got through, which tells you something. Even inside a structure built to control desire, desire still found a way out. So tonight, as you lie there in the dark, maybe think about the ridiculous weight one idea, virginity, has carried through human history. How it went from a practical concern for paternity to a cultural obsession that still echoes in purity rings, locker room gossip, and all those weird metaphors involving flowers and locked doors. And maybe it's worth asking, what happens when you strip all that away? When you stop pretending that your value is measured by something invisible, unverifiable, and deeply misunderstood? Maybe then you get to reclaim the story, or at least stop handing it over to people who were never meant to tell it in the first place. Let's walk straight into Sparta, shall we? Not the slow-motion six-pack movie version. The real Sparta. Dirtier, colder, and significantly more disturbing. You think ancient Greece was all Socratic debate and marble statues, but Sparta? Sparta was something else entirely. A place where boys were trained to kill by the time they could carry a spear, where girls were told to bear strong warriors, and where the state didn't just oversee your battles, it managed your bedroom too. From the moment a Spartan boy was born, he wasn't really his mother's child. He belonged to the state. If he didn't pass inspection, meaning if he looked too weak, too small, too anything, he might be abandoned on a hillside. Brutal, yes, but that was the Spartan way. Only the strongest survived, and from that point on, sex, love, and emotional connection were carefully pruned to fit the needs of the military machine. Here's your historical fact. At around the age of 7, Spartan boys entered the agouge, the rigorous state-run education system designed to turn them into perfect soldiers. And part of that system involved an older male mentor, usually a much older one, who was expected not just to train the boy, but to form a deep emotional and often sexual relationship with him. This was institutionalized, not hidden, not taboo. The state encouraged it, believing it forged bonds that would translate into loyalty on the battlefield. And no, that's not some fringe theory. It's recorded across multiple ancient sources. The line between mentorship, affection, and coercion was blurry at best, and non-existent at worst. These boys were too young to consent in any modern sense of the word, but in Sparta that wasn't even a question. The relationship was framed as honourable, character-building, something that made both parties more Spartan. Now for your fringe fact. According to some accounts, Spartan women were known for shouting public insults at bachelors during certain festivals. That's right. If a man reached adulthood without marrying, he was paraded around and mocked by women in the streets. Sparta was deeply invested in who you slept with, how often, and why. Sexuality wasn't private. It was performance, punishment, and policy. And that brings us to the weird, sweaty heart of it all. In Sparta, your body didn't belong to you. It belonged to the system. Sex wasn't about love, it was about function, whether that was reproducing future soldiers or strengthening the bonds between warriors. The state saw intimacy as a tool. If it made you a better fighter, it was allowed, encouraged even. If it made you weak or distracted you from duty, it was scorned. Now, on paper, Spartan women had more rights than women in most other Greek city-states. They could own land. They were educated. They were physically trained. But before you throw a parade, take a breath. That freedom was conditional. It existed solely to support their role as mothers of warriors. Everything, from their athletic conditioning to the age they married, was designed to optimize childbirth and keep the bloodline strong. If you couldn't produce healthy sons, your value plummeted fast. Romance? Not really a thing. Marriages were arranged, often with little ceremony. In fact, the wedding night was famously bizarre. The bride would have her head shaved and wear a man's cloak. The groom would then sneak in, usually under cover of darkness, to consummate the marriage, and then sneak back out to his barracks. Because even after marriage, most men continued to live and train with their fellow soldiers. Wives were visited like side quests. So here we are, in one of the most famous warrior cultures in history, and what do we find? A place where love is minimized, where affection is redirected toward your superior officer, and where sexuality is micromanaged in the name of strength and survival. It's not just uncomfortable, it's clinical. And yet scholars still debate the nature of these relationships. Some argue that the bonds between Spartan boys and their mentors weren't always sexual, that they could be purely emotional, based on mentorship and admiration. Others say that's revisionist thinking, that the ancient sources are clear, and that the state both expected and orchestrated these encounters. Either way, it's hard to ignore the cold reality. These boys didn't have a choice. And when sex is designed by a government rather than born of personal agency, even the most noble intentions start to rot. What's unsettling isn't just what happened, but how normalized it was. Imagine growing up in a place where your first real relationship isn't with a crush or a classmate, but with a man decades older who's assigned to you by the state, where affection isn't discovered, it's scheduled, where the language of love is replaced by the language of discipline and duty. And sure, there's pride, there's unity. Spartans were famously loyal, courageous, and disciplined. But underneath all that muscle and bronze is a society that sacrificed emotional autonomy in the name of perfection. And when you zoom out, you start to see the pattern again. Sex as currency, as control, as a way to mould humans into something useful for someone else. You can't help but wonder how many of those boys looked back on their youth and thought, was that love? Or just another drill? How many girls dreamed of lives beyond breeding and competition? Because make no mistake, Spartan girls weren't just childbearers. They were trained to be tough, to compete, to fight each other for the best mates. Love wasn't tender, it was war. So as you drift tonight, think about that. How a society so admired for its strength built that strength on a foundation of deeply managed, often coerced sexuality. And how even in a place where everyone was fit, fierce and focused, no one was really free. Now take a sharp turn from the dust and discipline of Sparta to something a little more indulgent. Gold, marble, grapes on silver platters. Welcome to Rome, ancient Rome, the empire of all empires, the place where you could attend a gladiator match in the afternoon, sip imported wine in the evening, and end the night in a haze of perfume, oil, and, well, other people. This is the world that sold itself as sophisticated and worldly, but underneath all that civilization? Yeah, still deeply uncomfortable. See, in Rome, sex was everywhere. On walls, in poems, in laws, in jokes scratched onto tavern benches. It was part of daily life, so integrated that it became almost unremarkable. Erotic frescoes in family homes, sculptures that left nothing to the imagination. The city of Pompeii alone was basically one long advertisement for pleasure. And unlike other ancient societies, the Romans didn't bother hiding their appetites. They flaunted them. But of course there was a catch. Because while some Romans enjoyed immense freedom, most people, not so lucky. Let's get the historical fact out of the way. Roman citizens, especially elite men, could do pretty much anything they wanted, as long as they stayed within social class expectations. They could take male or female lovers, have affairs, visit brothels, keep enslaved people for sexual purposes, and even write poetry about it. As long as you were the active partner, the dominant one, you were considered strong and masculine, but if you were passive, submissive, suddenly you were weak, less of a man. That's how twisted the rules were. And the fringe fact, Roman brothels often used phallic graffiti, yep, literal penis drawings, as wayfinding signs, like, hey, the action's this way. You could be walking down a street and see a carved stone pointing toward a room with 10 small cubicles and a menu of services on the wall. Efficient, sure. Also, extremely casual. But here's the part that ruins the party. Because while we like to picture Rome as this wild, sensual playground full of equality and exploration, the truth is way darker. Most of the people involved in those famous Roman sexual escapades didn't get a choice. Enslaved bodies were everywhere. In homes, in streets, in private chambers. Roman citizens had full legal rights to use enslaved people however they wished, including sexually. There were no boundaries, no protections, no concept of consent as we understand it today. You can almost picture it. A grand villa, sunlight streaming in through the columns, the air thick with incense and chatter. A senator laughs as he plucks grapes from a servant's platter, then gestures for that same servant to follow him into the next room. No one blinks, no one stops him, because in Rome, power meant access, and access meant everything. And women? Let's just say they weren't throwing orgies for fun. Upper-class Roman women lived under the constant watch of fathers, husbands and tutors. Their bodies were tied to family reputation and inheritance. Sure, some broke through, had affairs, took lovers, wrote poetry. But that wasn't the norm. For the average Roman woman, marriage was arranged, childbirth was constant, and public behaviour was scrutinised down to the hemline. Meanwhile, sex was used as punishment, as humiliation, as politics. Enemies were publicly raped to show dominance. Men accused of treason were sometimes described as being used like women, because for Romans, submission was the ultimate insult. These weren't just slurs. They were encoded in law, shouted in the Senate, carved into tombstones. And let's not forget the imperial palace, where things got especially weird. Emperors often did whatever they wanted, and we do mean whatever. Caligula, Nero, Tiberius. Those names don't just show up in high school textbooks, they're whispered about for a reason. Tiberius allegedly kept a group of young boys on the island of Capri to perform for him in fountains. Caligula supposedly held public weddings to his horses and made senators watch. It's hard to separate myth from fact at this point, but the fact that these stories exist at all says a lot about the normalization of power-fueled perversion. And yet, for all this, Roman culture also praised love. Romantic poetry thrived. Ovid, Catullus, and Propertius wrote verses that could make you blush or break your heart. The same society that dehumanized so many still produced art that aches with tenderness. That's what makes it so complicated, so uncomfortable, because it forces you to ask, how do you make sense of a world where poetry and abuse, consent and coercion, luxury and brutality all exist side by side? That's where the scholarly debates get heated. Some argue that Rome's sexual openness made it more liberated, more accepting of difference. Others point out that this so-called freedom only applied to a small elite, while everyone else lived under systems of exploitation so normalized they weren't even questioned. And both sides have a point. You can't ignore the complexity. So you lie there now, picturing marble halls, satin sheets, and whispered Latin. It all seems so distant, so stylized. But underneath the golden veneer was a reality that still echoes today, where power decided who got pleasure and who got used, where desire was public, but safety was scarce, where sex wasn't just something you did, it was something you were based on your rank, your role, your usefulness. Maybe that's why Rome still haunts us, because it laid the blueprint for a society that celebrated sex loudly while silently denying it to the people who needed the most protection. It promised pleasure, but only to the powerful, and even thousands of years later we're still struggling to separate the fantasy from the fallout. So now we slide east, past the crumbling columns of Rome, across desert sands and winding trade routes, until you find yourself deep inside the forbidden city of ancient China, where the walls are high, the whispers are soft, and behind every door is a carefully managed secret. Tonight's story takes you into the world of eunuchs, a group of men who lost everything to gain proximity to power, and ended up becoming some of the most influential and uncomfortable figures in history. Picture this. You're a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 from a poor family. Your parents are struggling. Then one day, someone makes an offer. A future in the imperial palace, food, safety, status. All you have to do is give up. Well, everything. You're marched to a clinic. If you're lucky, a clean one. No anesthesia, no sympathy. They take it all. Sometimes it kills you. If it doesn't, congratulations. You're now a eunuch, property of the court. And here's your historical fact. For over 2,000 years, eunuchs were a cornerstone of Chinese imperial governance. They served as guards, secretaries, advisors, and spies. In some dynasties, they ran entire departments of government, controlled access to the emperor, and sometimes even orchestrated coups. The Ming dynasty was practically run by eunuchs at certain points, none more infamous than Wei Zhongxian, who manipulated court politics to such an extreme that he had his enemies tortured and entire families erased. So how did they get so powerful? Easy. Proximity. Because only eunuchs were allowed into the inner palace, the area where the emperor's wives and concubines lived. The logic was brutally simple. No genitals, no threat. The emperor didn't want competition, and eunuchs were considered safe. But here's where it gets deeply ironic. In trying to eliminate sexual threat, the court inadvertently created a new kind of danger: political intimacy. That brings us to your fringe fact. Some eunuchs faked their castration. That's right. Desperate for palace access and aware of the influence eunuchs held, certain men would bribe doctors or mutilate themselves just enough to pass the inspection. One eunuch from the Qing dynasty was found, after his death, to be completely intact. He'd fooled the system for decades. Imagine the tension of living a double life like that, surrounded by suspicion, within a court that could kill you for sneezing too loudly. And that tension, it runs through the entire system. Because eunuchs weren't just bureaucrats. They were also caught in this liminal space, not fully men, not women, not celibate by choice, yet expected to live as if desire no longer applied to them. Their bodies were changed, but their humanity wasn't erased. Many developed deep emotional bonds with concubines and princesses. Some were rumoured to have secret affairs, even adopted children. They moved through the palace like ghosts, watching, listening, quietly shaping history while never being allowed to truly live it. You start to see the pattern again, a system built on control, where intimacy is so threatening it must be surgically removed, where proximity to power demands total self-erasure. And it wasn't just a job, it was a life sentence. Eunuchs were often forbidden to leave the palace. They died there, were buried there, their names erased from family records. No legacy, no lineage, just silence. And yet, the paradox. Eunuchs were often the ones who knew everything. They saw the emperor in his most private moments, they overheard pillow talk, kept track of pregnancies, intercepted letters. They managed access, determined who saw whom, when, and why. In many ways, they were the gatekeepers of the empire's most intimate secrets, but with that power came danger. Eunuchs were resented by scholars and officials who saw them as unworthy and impure. Accusations of corruption were constant, sometimes true, sometimes political theatre. The deeper their involvement, the more despised they became, and yet the system never changed. Every dynasty needed them, even as they pretended not to trust them. This is where the scholarly debate gets spicy. Some historians argue that eunuchs were the backbone of palace stability, efficient, loyal, unencumbered by personal ambition. Others say they were parasites, exploiting their unique position to manipulate emperors and punish rivals. The truth, predictably, sits somewhere in the middle. Because how do you separate a person's actions from the trauma that created them? Now pause. Imagine being that boy again, the one who survived the operation, who rose through the ranks, who learned to read scrolls, decipher moods, smile at the right time. He's in his 60s now, stooped, robes brushing marble floors. He remembers every secret whispered in these halls. He's seen love affairs, betrayals, assassinations. But when he dies, he'll be buried outside the ancestral tombs, because no matter how powerful he became, he never stopped being a tool. Altered, owned. It's a quiet kind of horror, the way someone can lose everything for the promise of safety, and still never really belong. And the real discomfort, it's how easily that trade-off was accepted. Castration was institutional, generational. Some families volunteered their sons because it was the only way to escape poverty. The system worked because it preyed on desperation. And yes, the physical act is horrifying enough, but the real wound wasn't between their legs, it was in the space they were forced to occupy. Not feared, not desired, not remembered. So tonight, as you lie there listening to the slow hum of the fan, imagine the corridors of the Forbidden City, the hushed footsteps of men who are both invisible and essential, their lives carved by other people's decisions, their desires denied, their humanity edited to fit a system that never asked them what they wanted. And maybe the most uncomfortable truth is this: the cost of proximity to power has always been highest for those forced to give up the parts of themselves that made them human in the first place. Now let's drift southwest, where the air grows heavier with incense, the temples rise like sandstone dreams, and the ancient texts lie curled like snakes in the shade. We're in India now, home to one of the most famously misunderstood books ever written, the Kama Sutra. Chances are you've heard the name. Maybe you've seen it on a bookshelf with a raised eyebrow. Maybe it was whispered at a sleepover. Maybe you just know it as that ancient sex manual. But the truth? Way more awkward, way more uncomfortable. Because the Kama Sutra wasn't about pleasure the way we imagine it. It was about hierarchy, power, and the kind of control that comes dressed in silk robes and spiritual metaphors. The Kama Sutra, written around the 3rd century CE, was attributed to a scholar named Vatsyayana, a celibate no less, which already sets the tone. It's not one long orgy of instructions. In fact, only about a fifth of it deals with sexual positions. The rest? It's basically an elite lifestyle guide for upper-class men. It covers everything from how to furnish your house to how to conduct polite conversation at dinner. You know, just in case you needed tips on choosing the right lover and arranging tasteful flower vases. Here's your historical fact. The Kama Sutra was written in Sanskrit, during a time when urban court life was flourishing and the merchant class was gaining influence. It was never intended for the masses. It wasn't passed around in palm leaf book clubs. It was crafted for a specific kind of man, Wealthy, educated, socially mobile, someone who needed advice on navigating the social and sexual politics of a rapidly shifting world. And now for your fringe fact. The original Kama Sutra included entire sections on how to manipulate trust, fake romantic interest, and even how to conduct affairs while keeping your wife unaware. One part literally offers strategies for winning over the wife of another man. That's not seduction, that's scheming. Honestly, you could swap out the word pleasure and replace it with espionage, and it would still make sense. But here's the twist that catches in your throat. While the Kama Sutra presents itself as a manual for the art of living, it's very clear about who gets to do the living. Men. Specifically, elite, straight, cis men. Women appear throughout the text, but often as tools, roles to be managed, emotions to be placated, bodies to be categorized by type and ranked by skill. There's even a section that compares women's personalities to birds, literal birds. Because nothing says intimacy like, she's a parrot type, talks too much and clings. You want to believe the Kama Sutra is about pleasure, and in a way it is, but it's pleasure within a box, a very decorated patriarchal box. Because for all the spiritual poetry and sensual imagery, the core message remains: control your household, control your women, control your reputation. The text teaches how to desire, yes, but also how to dominate tastefully. It turns sex into a ladder of power, where only a few get to climb, and yet, here's where things get weirdly complicated. The Kama Sutra also gives women a kind of presence that's missing from many other ancient texts. It discusses their preferences, their skills, their opinions. Courtesans in particular are portrayed as intelligent, witty and resourceful. Some even outsmart kings. But, and here's the catch, they're allowed this agency only because they're outside the system. They don't belong to husbands, they don't represent families, they exist in the margins, and that's what makes them temporarily powerful. So there's your uncomfortable balance. Women in the home must be loyal, passive and well-behaved. Women outside the home can be clever, desirable and free, but only until they're no longer useful. Courtesans were trained in music, poetry, political gossip, and how to flatter the right man at the right time. They were, in a way, human art installations. But when their beauty faded or their clients moved on, most were cast aside without ceremony. Meanwhile, sex in this world wasn't just physical, it was karmic. It had implications. Vatsyayana makes it clear, sex is one of the three main goals of life. Karma, alongside Arthur, material success, and Dharma, moral duty. But instead of elevating it into a truly equal space, he just tied it more tightly to social status. If you were poor, your pleasure didn't matter. If you were a woman, your pleasure was conditional. If you were queer, well, you were mostly erased or exoticized. And speaking of erasure, there's still fierce debate among scholars about how inclusive the Kama Sutra really was. Some claim it quietly acknowledges same-sex desire, pointing to subtle phrasing and ambiguous references. Others argue those inclusions were coded and limited, seen as curiosities rather than valid forms of love. What's clear is that none of those desires were given the same weight or dignity as heterosexual male pleasure. So tonight, you're lying there with this uncomfortable knowledge. One of the world's most famous texts about sex was never really about liberation. It was about grooming elite men to navigate a world where control was disguised as culture, where love was negotiable, but status wasn't. And what makes it even harder to untangle is how beautifully the whole thing is wrapped. The Kama Sutra is full of gorgeous metaphors, lush settings, descriptions of scented oils, moonlit encounters, and gardens in bloom. It presents itself as enlightened, refined, almost progressive. But beneath the surface, it's still a manual for maintaining the status quo. Because that's the thing about uncomfortable truths. They rarely arrive in black and white. They come dressed in poetry, in sandalwood, in silk. But look close, and you'll see the gears turning underneath. Who gets to desire? Who gets desired? Who decides? So as the fan hums and the room quiets, imagine the man who wrote this text. Calm, scholarly, respected. Celibate even. Writing about women's bodies like chess pieces. Crafting a blueprint not just for pleasure, but for politeness, patriarchy, and power, all rolled into one. And then ask yourself, when a culture teaches desire, but only through the lens of control, what kind of love does it really believe in? We move now into the dark corners of stone castles and candlelit monasteries, where whispers carry more weight than laws, and shame becomes a second skin. Welcome to medieval Europe, the era where guilt became an institution, and desire was either condemned, punished, or stuffed under a wool tunic and denied until it festered. This was a time when the church didn't just have a say in your sex life, it was your sex life. And spoiler alert, if you were hoping for romance or bodily autonomy, you're going to be deeply disappointed. Let's set the mood. The year is something like 1243. You're in a small village. Your world is ruled by two forces, the local lord, who controls your land, and the local priest who controls your soul. You've never read a book, but you've heard plenty of sermons. You know, for example, that the human body is weak and sinful, that pleasure is a temptation, that lust is a path to hell. And somehow, all of that responsibility falls harder on one group than the other. Can you guess who? Yep, women. Here's your historical fact. By the time the church fully solidified its sexual doctrines, around the 12th century, it had redefined sex entirely. It was no longer something natural or even neutral. It was dangerous. It was tolerated only within marriage, and only if it was strictly for procreation. Any pleasure taken during the act, even by a married couple, was considered suspect, possibly sinful. So basically, if you were enjoying yourself, you were already halfway to eternal damnation. And now, your fringe fact. Medieval people had actual handbooks on when it was morally acceptable to have sex. Tuesdays were frowned upon, so were feast days, Lent, Advent, and about 100 other times throughout the year. Some historians estimate that a pious couple following the rules could legally engage in marital intimacy on maybe 60 days out of 365. That's right, 60. And again, only if they weren't too into it. The consequences of this puritanical squeeze were predictably weird. Chastity became a full-time job, complete with its own accessories. You've probably heard of chastity belts, those infamous metal contraptions supposedly locked around women's waists to keep them pure. And while there's serious scholarly debate about whether they were ever actually used, most examples are likely Renaissance hoaxes or later museum fakes. The idea of them was real enough to scare people. The fact that someone even imagined locking up a body like that tells you everything you need to know about medieval control fantasies. But it didn't stop at imaginary belts. The church invented sin categories like it was running a shame-themed carnival. Masturbation, mortal sin, homosexuality, mortal sin, lustful thoughts, sin. Anything outside of missionary position in a heterosexual marriage. You guessed it, sin. They created a detailed hierarchy of sexual acts, each with its own spiritual penalty, like a point system where the prize was an afterlife without fire, and of course none of this hit everyone equally. Men had confession booths, women had stakes. That's not hyperbole. The very concept of female desire was so threatening that when it surfaced outside male control, it often triggered witchcraft accusations. If a woman was too independent, too sexual, too unmarried, or just too inconvenient, she could be accused of seducing men via demonic means. Because clearly, a woman wanting sex had to be supernatural. And here comes your open, scholarly debate. Was the medieval church truly obsessed with suppressing sex? Or was it more about controlling society through predictable rules and rituals? Some historians argue that this wasn't about morality, it was about order. The church needed a way to assert dominance, and managing the most personal, primal aspects of human life was a shortcut to total control. Others think the priests themselves were genuinely terrified of desire, especially their own, and projected that fear onto everyone else, probably both. Meanwhile, outside the churches and castles, the peasantry had a more practical relationship with sex. Life was hard. Food was scarce. You didn't have time for theological debates when your entire focus was surviving winter. And yet, even among the common folk, the shadow of shame loomed. Women who bore children out of wedlock were punished, ostracised, sometimes forced to parade through the village with shaved heads or in rags. Men. They mostly got warnings. But there were cracks in the wall. In secret, people still loved. They still touched. They still wrote songs and poetry. Courtly love became a popular theme. This idea of longing from a distance, of knights pining for unattainable ladies, of passion that was never consummated. It was erotic in its restraint. Longing was allowed, completion was not. The less you touched, the more romantic it was. Because if pleasure was a sin, then denial became holy. Imagine being a young woman in this world. You're 15, maybe 16, newly married to a man twice your age. You've been warned your whole life not to want anything, not to think about your own body, not to feel pleasure. And then one night someone says, "Obey your husband." That's it. No education, no context, just blind submission. And if you're hurt, confused or scared, that's not the system's problem, that's your penance. And on the other side of town, a monk is fasting, flagellating himself, begging God to forgive him for his dreams. Because he too was taught that desire makes him dirty. So he punishes the body to save the soul. The flesh is weak, the flesh is bad, but the flesh is also unavoidable. The result? A whole continent filled with people terrified of their own skin. So tonight, under the hum of your fan and the weight of your blanket, picture this world, not as distant as it seems. A world where guilt is baked into the walls and love has to sneak through the cracks like ivy. Where wanting something isn't a freedom but a test. And the worst part, you don't even know who's grading you. Because when a society teaches you that your body is your enemy, eventually you start to believe it. Let's go ahead and step into the fire, literally, because we've reached the age of witches, not the broomstick, pointy hat kind. The real ones, or at least the real women who got accused of being witches simply for breathing wrong or showing a little too much independence. This is the era when female desire wasn't just suspicious, it was dangerous. When a woman wanting control over her own body could be interpreted as a pact with the devil. Welcome to early modern Europe, where the line between sexuality and heresy was razor thin, and that razor was usually in the hands of some sweaty town official with too much power and not enough therapy. Picture it. Small village, cobblestone streets, cold wind slicing through the fields. People are dying from plagues, crops are failing, babies are stillborn, and no one knows why. So what do? Do they investigate soil conditions or health practices? Of course not. They accuse women. Because clearly someone cast a spell. And who better to blame than the unmarried midwife? Or the widow who lives alone? Or the girl who knows how herbs work? Or, and this is key, the woman who enjoys sex or doesn't act ashamed of it. Here's your historical fact. Between the 15th and 18th centuries, tens of thousands of people were executed across Europe and colonial America in witch trials. About 75 to 85% of them were women, and one of the most common accusations, carnal relations with the devil. That's right. Not only were these women accused of dark magic, they were specifically accused of engaging in erotic, demonic rituals. That wasn't a metaphor. Authorities literally believed that witches had sex with Satan in the woods at night. Why? Because what terrified the church more than women having sex? Women having sex without permission. And now, for your fringe fact, there were actual witch-hunting manuals, thick books, passed around and studied like textbooks. The most famous was the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487. It spent an obscene number of pages obsessing over female sexuality. According to its authors, women were more susceptible to demonic influence because they were weaker in faith and more carnal by nature. It even explains how witches supposedly stole men's penises and kept them in boxes. Yes, that's a real section. Scholars have debated whether this was metaphorical or just a result of centuries of deeply repressed male fear. The deeper you look, the more you realise. These weren't just superstitious overreactions. They were organised attempts to suppress any version of femininity that wasn't quiet, domestic, and male-approved. If you had too much knowledge, you were dangerous. If you had too much charisma, you were seductive. If you had no husband, you were probably planning something. And the trials themselves, they were not just about burning people alive. They were long, brutal ordeals. Women were often imprisoned in dark, filthy cells for months. They were tortured, on record, to extract confessions. Forced to name others, forced to confess to impossible crimes, sleep deprivation, thumbscrews, water ordeals, red-hot pincers. And at the heart of it all, there was always a question of sexuality. Did you lay with the devil? Did you tempt men with your body? Did you seduce the priest in his dreams? It's not a stretch to say these weren't just religious purges, they were sexualized purges. Punishments for not conforming, for being too visible, for not fitting the mould. Women were burned for being midwives, herbalists, sexually autonomous, or even just too outspoken. And what's more disturbing is how many women helped enforce it. Because in a system built on fear, aligning yourself with power feels safer than being its next target. Now, here comes the academic debate. Were witch hunts truly about sex and gender, or were they more about economics and power consolidation? Some scholars argue that many of these accusations were fueled by land disputes or community rivalries. Others insist that misogyny and sexual control were central, not incidental. The truth, again, probably lives in the overlap. Because in a world where women were systematically denied rights, accusing one of witchcraft was a disturbingly effective way to remove her from the social equation. Meanwhile, the sexual double standard thrived. Men could chase mistresses, assault servants, even father children out of wedlock with minimal consequence. Women, they got shackles and firewood, and yet the myth of the sexually deviant woman persisted. The idea that a woman who enjoyed sex was inherently evil, tied to darkness, probably in league with Lucifer himself. Why? Because to patriarchal systems, desire that doesn't serve men is terrifying. Imagine being a teenage girl in 1600s Scotland. You've just started noticing things. How your body moves, how people look at you differently. You mention a dream to a friend, something innocent, maybe even sacred to you. Word gets around. A week later, you're hauled in front of elders and asked to explain yourself, asked whether you dance with spirits, whether you tempted someone, whether you floated. You're terrified, but you don't know what to say because no one ever taught you how to talk about your own body without shame. So you stutter, you cry, and suddenly, that's proof enough. Or picture the village midwife. She's delivered half the town's babies. She knows herbs that ease pain, help with birth, maybe even prevent it. And because her knowledge isn't sanctioned by the church, it becomes a threat. A woman helping other women take control of their bodies? Burn her. Not because of what she did, but because of what she knew. And yet, even in this bleak chapter, you find resilience. Women whispered their truths to each other, passed on knowledge in secret, hid herbs in aprons, protected each other when they could. They turned survival into a quiet form of rebellion, because even when systems tried to strip them of agency, they found ways to reclaim it, however small. So tonight, think about the fires that lit up the night sky, not just as executions, but as warnings. Be quiet, be obedient, be ashamed. And how, for centuries, that warning echoed through every generation, teaching women to hide their hunger, their knowledge, their voices. And ask yourself, what parts of that message are still humming under the surface today? Now slide open an ornate wooden door. Step into the warm, perfumed shadows of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that lasted over 600 years and stretched across continents, religions, and cultures. Here, behind the high walls of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, lies one of the most romanticised and misunderstood institutions in history, the harem. Go ahead, admit it. You hear that word, and your brain probably serves up some gauzy Hollywood fantasy. Reclining women feeding each other figs, veils fluttering, laughter drifting through the air like incense. Yeah. No. The truth is far stranger, way darker, and loaded with power plays disguised as luxury. At its core, the imperial harem was a political machine. It wasn't a pleasure dome. It wasn't a royal orgy on demand. It was a complex hierarchy of women, concubines, wives, daughters, mothers, all locked inside the inner palace. Their job? To serve, to survive, and maybe, bear a son who'd survive long enough to become sultan. And for most of them, the odds were grim. Here's your historical fact. The imperial harem in Topkapi Palace wasn't just a place to stash pretty women. It was a critical part of the Ottoman power structure. At its peak, it housed hundreds of women, many of them enslaved from the Caucasus, North Africa, or Eastern Europe. These women were trained in music, poetry, etiquette, and politics. The most powerful among them could influence court decisions, arrange marriages, even sway matters of war and succession. The woman with the higher status, the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, arguably one of the most powerful political figures in the entire empire. And here's your fringe fact. Despite their confinement, some of these women wielded incredible behind-the-scenes power. During the 16th and 17th centuries, there was even a period known as the Sultanate of Women, when multiple Valid sultans and favoured concubines ruled through weak or young sultans. Hürrem Sultan, for example, an enslaved woman from what's now Ukraine, became the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent and effectively co-ruled the empire for years. She didn't just survive the system, she bent it to her will. But let's not over-romanticize. For every harem, there were hundreds, thousands of women who didn't get anywhere, who were taken from their homes as children, stripped of their names, converted to Islam, renamed, retrained, and told they now lived at the pleasure of one man. Many of them never even saw the Sultan. They were part of a human archive, catalogued and shelved for potential use. And if they didn't rise, they simply disappeared into the inner walls. Their lives faded like the paint on a forgotten mosaic. Sex in this context wasn't pleasure, it was strategy. A concubine who caught the Sultan's eye might be elevated, might bear a child, might gain status. But she was also instantly in competition with every other woman around her. The harem wasn't a sisterhood, it was a battleground. Poisonings happened, spies were everywhere. If your son became a threat to another concubine's son, things could get lethal, and the closer you got to the Sultan, the more dangerous it became. The Sultan himself? He was expected to be virile, dominant and distant. Early Ottoman rulers took multiple concubines, but avoided official marriages so their heirs wouldn't have political claims through their mothers' families. That sounds like freedom, but it was really a cage of its own. The Sultan's love life wasn't personal, it was dynastic, a tool to secure the empire. And the boys born from these relationships, they were pitted against each other for succession in brutal fashion. Sometimes quite literally, because for centuries it was customary for the new sultan to execute his brothers upon ascending the throne. That's not just a broken family tree, that's a bloodbath with throw pillows. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The harem was not a fantasy. It was an institution built on bodies, trained into obedience, monitored constantly, and framed as elegant so no one had to acknowledge the human cost. And if you think the women had it bad, don't forget the men assigned to guard them. The eunuchs, many of them enslaved Africans, castrated and forced to spend their lives serving a system that both feared and fetishized them. Remember Section 7? Yeah, they're back. There's still debate among scholars about whether life in the harem was hell or something more complicated. Some argue that despite the limitations, women had more access to education, safety and influence than they would have outside the palace. Others insist the whole system was just gilded imprisonment, oppression disguised as opportunity. And both sides have a point. A concubine might never face starvation or street harassment, but she also never got to choose who she was, where she went, or who touched her. Now imagine a young girl, 13 maybe, newly arrived. She doesn't speak the language, her hair's just been cut. She's renamed Gulbahar, or Flower of Spring, and handed a silk robe. She's told to smile, to listen, to walk just so. She's taught to sing, to pour tea, to lower her eyes. She may never leave this palace again, and if she resists, no one will ever know. And yet, within this system, women carved out what space they could. They built friendships, protected each other when they dared, passed messages, music, stories, even plotted. Because when you're trapped inside a system designed to reduce you to decoration, rebellion can take the form of a soft voice in the dark saying, "We are more than this." So tonight, picture the harem not as fantasy, but as theatre, an elaborate stage where women performed survival beneath layers of silk. Where love was dangerous, motherhood was political, and beauty came with a contract you never signed. Because sometimes, the softest rooms hide the sharpest truths. From the embroidered silks of the Ottoman harem, now trace your fingers along rice paper walls and follow the sound of a koto string plucked in the distance. Welcome to Japan, where intimacy and culture have always been wrapped together like an origami secret, folded just right so only a few ever saw what was really inside. Tonight we're stepping into the Edo period, roughly 1603 to 1868, a time when Japan was sealed off from the outside world, cultivating its own wildly complex systems of beauty, power and controlled desire. You've heard the word geisha, right? Maybe pictured a woman in a silk kimono, white painted face, coy smile, pouring tea in a flickering lamplight. But here's the twist. Geisha weren't prostitutes, not in the way Western history tried to label them. They were artists, entertainers, masters of subtlety. Their job wasn't sex, it was performance. They told stories, played music, knew how to read a room better than any modern PR agent. But behind all that grace and poetry was a system where intimacy, both physical and emotional, was highly managed, incredibly ritualized, and deeply transactional. Here's your historical fact. During the Edo period, Japan created entire licensed pleasure districts, walled-in areas where sex work was legal, taxed, and carefully surveilled. The most famous of these was Yoshiwara in Edo, now Tokyo. Inside its gates lived a hierarchy of women, from lower-ranked courtesans to the elite oiran, who were like queens of the red light world. These oiran were so revered they could choose their clients, wore layers of ornate robes, and walked with an entourage so slow and ceremonial it could stop traffic. But none of it was about freedom. Every choice they made was curated, every smile, every glance, premeditated for someone else's pleasure. And here's your fringe fact. Some samurai were forbidden by law to marry certain classes of women, but that didn't stop them from forming long-term, almost spousal relationships with courtesans or male actors. In fact, during the Edo period, same-sex relationships between men, particularly older samurai and their younger apprentices, were not only common but often idealized in literature and art. There were even love manuals written for these relationships, complete with etiquette guides. So yeah, love in feudal Japan was a far cry from our modern binaries. And yet, no matter how poetic it all sounds, there's always that edge of control. Whether male or female, rich or poor, no one really belonged to themselves. The Tokugawa shogunate, Japan's military government, ran everything with precision. Your role, your class, your clothing, your movements, prescribed. If you were born a farmer, you died a farmer. If you were born into the pleasure districts, you lived and died behind those gates, unless someone bought your contract. Literally bought your life. Imagine that. Your name isn't even your own. You're renamed upon entry. You're trained in how to walk, bow, laugh. If you're lucky, you become an oiran, and men travel miles just to speak with you. If you're unlucky, you stay at the bottom. Overworked, undervalued, and disposable. There's no social ladder. There's a stage, and you either perform or disappear. And even for the geisha, those revered performers, the boundaries were blurry. While their job was not explicitly sexual, their lives still depended on patronage. Wealthy men would sponsor them, protect them, sometimes fall in love with them, and when that happened? Well, let's just say a geisha's ability to stay financially afloat often rested on how well she navigated the fine line between art and intimacy. She was not a sex worker, but she also wasn't free from the politics of male desire. Meanwhile, out in the streets and bathhouses, ukiyo-e prints, what we'd now call erotic art, circulated like gossip. These shunga prints didn't shy away from anything. They were explicit, exaggerated, and surprisingly cheerful. Lovemaking depicted in lush detail, often with humour and occasionally with sea creatures. Yep, you've probably seen that one. These images were sold in markets, kept in bedrooms, and sometimes gifted to newlyweds. In that way, Japan was far more visually open about sex than its European counterparts at the time. But again, don't mistake visibility for liberation. These prints were mostly made by men, for men, about fantasies that didn't always reflect reality. Women's pleasure was often illustrated, but not always understood. And for those actually living in the pleasure districts, there was no option to just opt out. Once you were in, that was it. Your body, your smile, your movements, they became part of someone else's entertainment package. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Some argue the pleasure districts were safe havens, a place where art, culture, and controlled desire flourished without the judgment of the outside world. Others say that's just a prettier cage, a prison with perfume, that the very structure of these places depended on controlling human intimacy, wrapping it in silk so no one had to see the cost. Now imagine a samurai, respected, feared, trained in combat. He walks into Yoshiwara, sheathes his sword, mandatory, and becomes just another client. He falls in love with an oiran, visits her weekly, brings her gifts. Maybe he thinks he can rescue her. Maybe she lets him believe it. But her contract? It belongs to the brothel. Her choices? Limited. Her smile? Practiced. Because behind every love story here is a ledger book, and that, more than anything, defines how desire operated in this world. Dressed in poetry, sold by the hour. So tonight, picture the lanterns swaying in the alleyways of Edo. The laughter of women who know the joke before it's told. The quiet defiance in every bow that's too deep. Every glance that lingers just long enough. Picture the lives choreographed down to the breath, all in the name of refined desire. And remember, not all cages have locks. Some come with fans and face paint, and no less a price. Let's step off the polished stage and back into the raw, cracked earth of something far more brutal. Something history still struggles to look at directly. You're no longer in painted palaces or perfume-slicked courtyards. You're on a dock thick with a stench of sweat, salt and desperation. Chains clink, barked orders echo in unfamiliar tongues, and somewhere nearby, someone's being priced, not for their skills, not for their mind, not even for their labour, but for their body. Tonight, we face one of the most devastating truths in human history. How slavery, across continents, across centuries, was never just about work. It was about sex, about ownership, about turning desire into weaponry. It's easy to talk about slavery in abstract terms. Numbers, ships, sugar plantations. But behind every statistic is a person whose body was not theirs to protect. A girl auctioned off at 12 because her developing breasts made her valuable. A man whipped not just to punish disobedience, but to break his will, and too often to mark him as sexually expendable. This wasn't incidental, it was structural. Because for centuries, enslaved people, especially women, weren't just forced to labour, they were forced to be available. Here's your historical fact. During the transatlantic slave trade, sexual exploitation of enslaved women was widespread and legally protected. In most colonial systems, there were no laws recognising rape of an enslaved person as a crime. They were considered property, and you can't legally rape property. Plantation owners routinely took enslaved women as concubines, or assaulted them without consequence. Their children, born from rape, were often forced into labour alongside their mothers, growing the owner's investment. And your fringe fact: in some parts of the Americas, enslaved men were also targeted, used for forced breeding, or assaulted by both male and female slave owners. While less often discussed, this part of history is just as real. It challenges modern assumptions about power, masculinity and victimhood, and yes, the trauma passed down through generations. But let's be clear, the system wasn't chaotic, it was methodical. Slave owners knew that sex could be used as a tool of control. Take a woman's agency, violate her body, and you don't just hurt her, you send a message to every person watching. This is what happens if you resist. This is what we can do. And if a child came of it, even better for the owner. Because in many colonies, the status of a child followed the mother. That meant more enslaved labourers, more property. Rape, then, wasn't just violence, it was economic strategy. This was true in the Americas, in the Caribbean, in the Middle East and beyond. The Ottoman Empire, the Mughal courts, even medieval European households kept enslaved concubines. It wasn't a cultural anomaly, it was a global pattern, and it wasn't limited to women. Enslaved boys and men were often forced to serve sexually, especially in private courts where silence could be maintained and shame weaponized. Now, here's the uncomfortable wrinkle. Sometimes these forced relationships were reframed as romantic, especially when the enslaved person became a long-term partner or bore children who were favoured. But romantic framing doesn't erase the power imbalance. What does consent mean when one person owns the other's life? This brings us to a long-standing scholarly debate. Were any of these relationships ever truly mutual, or were they all just different shades of coercion? Some historians argue that long-term relationships between enslaved people and owners, particularly in domestic roles, could evolve into emotionally complex bonds. Others insist that framing those situations as anything but exploitation is dangerously revisionist. After all, when survival depends on pleasing your oppressor, love becomes a survival tactic, not a choice. Now picture an enslaved girl, 13 or 14, brought into a house to work as a maid. Her owner starts giving her gifts, then touches, then orders. No one intervenes. Everyone pretends it's normal. Maybe she learns to smile through it. Maybe she has his child. Maybe he sells her anyway. Or maybe she's punished when the wife finds out. And that girl? Her story has been told in every empire that ever ran on human bondage. Enslaved women often found themselves trapped in a triangle of punishment. Desired by their male owners, hated by their owners' wives, and abandoned by the law. It was lose, lose, lose. Many were forced into favourites, paraded around, expected to be grateful. Others were raped in fields, left to hide their trauma in silence. And still, somehow enslaved people found ways to resist. They formed bonds with each other, protected their children, coded their grief into music. whispered warnings, escaped when they could. In Haiti, Brazil, and the southern United States, uprisings weren't just about labour, they were about reclaiming the right to their own bodies. Because when your body is the battlefield, every act of refusal becomes a revolution. What's especially uncomfortable is how this legacy lingers. The hypersexualization of black bodies, for example, didn't come out of nowhere. It was cultivated through slave auction posters, colonial medical texts, and racist pseudoscience, all designed to justify exploitation. Today, it still echoes in media, in stereotypes, in laws that disproportionately police certain bodies more than others. And it's not ancient history. The descendants of enslaved people still live with generational trauma shaped, in part, by this intimate violence. It doesn't just disappear, it mutates. It hides in textbooks that gloss over plantation life as if it were a sepia-toned movie set. It vanishes from national curriculums, and that's not an accident, it's a choice. So tonight, as the room darkens and the sounds around you quiet down, let this truth settle. Slavery was never just about work. It was about domination at every level. The body, the mind, the will. And when a system teaches that owning a person includes owning their desire, the damage doesn't end when the chains come off. It keeps whispering, generation after generation, until someone finally names it, looks it in the eye, and says, "This happened." Now take a deep breath and straighten your posture, because we're stepping into a time that loves to pretend it was prim, proper, and pearl-clutchingly pure. Welcome to the Victorian era, where the dresses were long, the table manners precise, and the hypocrisy spectacular. This is the century where everything from table legs to female ankles was considered potentially scandalous. And yet, behind the velvet curtains of polite society, well, let's just say the repression was only skin deep. It's England, the mid-1800s. The British Empire is booming, trains are chugging, tea is pouring, and Queen Victoria is the face of morality itself. Publicly, the message is clear. Sex is private, passion is dangerous, and respectable women don't even think about that sort of thing. But here's the kicker. Beneath all the corsets and candlelit sermons, desire didn't die. It just got dressed up, denied, and locked into a closet full of contradictions. Your historical fact for tonight. Victorian London had one of the highest recorded populations of sex workers in Europe. By the 1850s, estimates suggest that tens of thousands of women were working in the sex trade, ranging from high-end courtesans who dined with nobles to poor girls on street corners barely surviving. This was the same city preaching moral purity, the same city that passed laws to shut down indecent literature, while simultaneously printing some of the most graphic erotica of the 19th century under the table. And here's your fringe fact. Hysteria, yes, that diagnosis, was considered a common female medical condition during this period. Symptoms? Anxiety, sexual frustration, irritability, basically anything that made women inconvenient. The treatment? Pelvic massage by a doctor, until the patient achieved hysterical paroxysm, a term that awkwardly skirts around what it really was, an orgasm. This wasn't fringe quackery, it was mainstream medicine. There were even steam-powered vibrating devices developed to assist physicians with the treatment. And just like that, the vibrator was born. Not as a symbol of liberation, but as a medical instrument for keeping women quiet. Now let's talk about the corset. More than just a fashion statement, the corset was the perfect metaphor for Victorian sexuality. Tight, structured, suffocating, beautiful, but deeply unnatural. Women were expected to mould their bodies to the ideal. Tiny waists, pale skin, dainty movements, all to signal virtue and desirability. Two traits that were constantly being held in tension. You had to be attractive, but not too attractive. Sweet, but not suggestive. Married, but not eager. A wife, but never a lover. And yet, here's where the hypocrisy hits peak performance. Men were not held to the same standard. Victorian gentlemen were expected to indulge their passions discreetly. They visited brothels, kept mistresses, frequented gentlemen's clubs that featured everything from burlesque to full-on debauchery. And all of it was tolerated as long as it was hidden. But a woman caught reading a romantic novel too eagerly. She was a problem. This era also brought about the medicalization of sexuality. Men like Richard von Krafft-Ebing and Havelock Ellis began cataloguing sexual deviance in hefty volumes, filled with case studies that blurred the line between science and gossip. Homosexuality was classified as a disorder, so was masturbation, so was female desire in general. These books didn't just pathologize, they moralized, and their reach spread across Europe and into the growing disciplines of psychology and criminology. So here's the scholarly debate that still swirls. Was the Victorian era uniquely repressive or just uniquely performative? Some historians argue that all the prudishness was just a facade, that behind closed doors the Victorians were as wild as any era before or after. Others insist the repression was real and had genuine psychological consequences, especially for women, whose entire emotional lives were deemed suspect if they didn't conform to the fragile mould of proper femininity. Truth? Probably both. A society can be both obsessed and ashamed. The Victorians practically patented that contradiction. Now imagine a young woman of 20. She's educated, barely. She's married, likely to a man she barely knows. She's been told all her life that nice girls don't have desires, but she does. And when she tries to talk about it, she's dismissed, prescribed tonics, told to rest, sent to a doctor who may or may not treat her condition, with a mechanical device that hums in the background of her confusion. Or picture the housemaid, lower class, unseen. She's assaulted by her employer, but when she speaks up, she's blamed, called a temptress, dismissed from service. No one listens. Because in the Victorian mind, the danger isn't what men do, it's what women provoke. And let's not forget the queer Victorians, those who had no place at all in public life, who fell in love in secret, wrote letters in code, carved out slivers of space in literary salons or underground clubs. For every Oscar Wilde, famously tried and imprisoned for gross indecency, there were countless others who lived and died never being able to say what they felt out loud. And yet, through all that repression, people still reached for connection. They wrote poems, they left pressed flowers in books, they risked ruin for one night of closeness. The more society tightened the corset, the more hearts beat against the bone. So tonight, picture London fog rolling over cobblestone streets. Picture a woman sitting by candlelight, reading a letter with trembling hands. Picture a man walking quickly down an alley, coat pulled tight, not because of the cold, but because he's terrified of being seen. Picture the surgeon with steady hands and a mind full of fear, writing down yet another disorder in his medical ledger that is, in truth, just someone wanting to feel wanted. Because in the Victorian age, sex wasn't absent. It was just hiding, under lace, behind law, inside locked diaries, waiting for someone, somewhere, to loosen the stays and finally exhale, step back from the parlours and gas lamps of Victorian England, and follow the thread of erased stories into the shadows, into corners of history that didn't make it into the textbooks. Not because nothing happened there, but because too much did. This time we're not talking about a place, but a thread, one that runs through every empire, every era, and every dusty archive with pages missing. This is the hidden history of queerness. The stories of those who dared to want differently, and the systems that tried over and over to erase them. You've probably heard the phrase, history is written by the victors. Cute, but it's more accurate to say history is written by the people in charge of the archives. And for a long time, the archivists had a very narrow idea of what love and desire should look like. Straight, married, and preferably aligned with property exchange. Anything else? Removed, edited, condemned, or, most often, ignored into oblivion. Here's your historical fact. In ancient Egypt, there's a fascinating tomb shared by two men, Khnumhotep and Niankhunum, who lived during the 5th dynasty over 4,000 years ago. Their tomb is filled with images of them touching noses, a sign of affection in Egyptian art, holding hands and embracing, depictions that are strikingly intimate. Many Egyptologists believe they were lovers. Some think they may have been twins or brothers. The debate rages, but what's undeniable is that the two men were buried together as equals, a rare honour, and their relationship was significant enough to be immortalised in stone. Now your fringe fact. In the 18th century Japan, nanshaku, male-male love, was a socially accepted and widely documented part of samurai culture. Relationships between older samurai and younger apprentices were formalised through codes of honour, with specific expectations of loyalty, mentorship, and yes, physical intimacy. It was written about in guides, depicted in art, and accepted as part of life, until Western influence arrived during the Meiji Restoration, and things started to get edited. And that's the pattern. Over and over, across cultures and time periods, you find records of queer lives, sometimes celebrated, sometimes tolerated, but often later erased. Ancient Greece is famous for its male-male relationships, especially between older and younger men. But did you know female same-sex love existed there too? The poet Sappho wrote lyric verses to women on the island of Lesbos, poetry so moving and openly affectionate that it gave us the term lesbian. But centuries of male translators twisted her meaning, downplayed her love, or turned it into vague metaphors about friendship. Because heaven forbid history be honest. So here's the uncomfortable truth. Queer people have always existed. What changes is the degree to which their stories are allowed to survive. In medieval Europe, the Catholic Church classified same-sex intimacy as sodomy, a category that included everything from sex acts to heresy. In some cities, men were burned or drowned for suspected relationships. In others, women lived together quietly, raised children, and were dismissed as spinsters or companions. Historians today call this romantic friendship, but let's be honest, that's probably just an academic euphemism for they were absolutely in love. There's a debate among scholars about whether modern sexual identities, gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc., can be applied to historical figures. Some argue those categories are too recent and culturally specific. Others say that's a convenient excuse to avoid naming what was clearly present. But either way, you can't unsee the pattern. Desire that doesn't align with the mainstream is pushed to the margins, renamed, or erased entirely. Take colonial America. While puritanical society preached strict moral codes, love letters between same-sex friends existed. Women wrote to each other with passionate language, often indistinguishable from romantic love. Did they act on it? We don't always know, but the fact that these letters had to be written in metaphors tells you enough about the risk. Or picture Weimar Berlin in the 1920s, before the Nazis rose to power. It was a haven for queer expression. There were gay clubs, trans cabarets, open relationships, and vibrant publications. But when fascism crept in, the archives were seized, destroyed, lives were ended, and the message was clear. Queer joy is a threat, and it will be punished. Even in places where queerness thrived for a time, India, with its Hijra communities, indigenous cultures across North America with two-spirit identities, Polynesian societies with fa'afafine, Western colonization often brought the eraser. Missionaries, legal codes, forced conversions. The goal wasn't just spiritual, it was sexual control. One kind of love was deemed sacred. Everything else, sinful, deviant, disposable. But queer people persisted. They always do. In letters, in poems, in coded language passed between allies, in theatre troupes, in travelling circuses, in underground clubs, even in the military, where relationships bloomed in foxholes, on ships, in barracks, hidden under layers of just friends and brotherhood. History doesn't always preserve them, but they're there, pressed between the lines, just waiting for someone to read closely. Imagine a young man in Renaissance Florence writing love poems to another boy. He's careful with his phrasing, but bold in his feeling. He knows the risk, but he writes anyway. Or a pair of women in 19th century Spain, fleeing the confines of their families, passing as roommates in a city where they can live quietly, holding hands only in the dark. Or think of a trans woman in Paris in the 1920s, working as a performer, admired on stage, insulted in the streets, and yet still walking tall, because this is who she is. Her body, her identity, her truth, whether or not the world knows what to do with it. So tonight, as you settle in, let yourself grieve a little, not just for the lives lost, but for the stories stolen, the joy that had to be hidden, the love that was rewritten as friendship, or worse, never written down at all. Because when history is silent, it's not because nothing happened, it's because someone decided whose desire mattered enough to remember. So now we arrive at a place where things start to feel clinical. You're no longer walking through candlelit alleys or dodging royal rules. You're lying on a couch in a quiet room while someone with a clipboard asks, "And how did that make you feel?" Welcome to the early 20th century, when sex stopped being just a sin or a secret and started becoming a subject for science, or at least something that looked like science. This is the age of psychoanalysis, and at the centre of it, sitting stiffly in his Vienna office, puffing on a cigar and scribbling notes, is Sigmund Freud, the man who single-handedly turned everyone's mother into a punchline. Freud is one of those historical figures we like to mock now, mostly because his ideas seem a little Freudian. But the truth is, his impact was massive. Before Freud, sex was moral or immoral, sacred or shameful. After Freud, sex was psychological. It was hidden in dreams, lurking in childhood, tangled up in repressed memories and subconscious desires. He cracked open the human mind and announced, "There's a lot of weird stuff in here, and most of it wants to have sex with your parents." Okay, he didn't say it exactly like that, but it's not far off. Here's your historical fact. Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex, named after the Greek myth, suggested that children go through a stage where they unconsciously desire their opposite-sex parent and feel rivalry with the same-sex one. According to Freud, this was a universal part of childhood development, and if you didn't deal with it properly, your adult relationships would suffer. You'd be forever haunted by that unresolved parental desire and likely end up very confused in therapy decades later. And your fringe fact? Freud believed that women who weren't satisfied in heterosexual relationships were simply stuck in an immature stage of psychosexual development, because obviously, the only correct way to be a woman was to want a man. Any deviation from that path? Repression, denial, hysteria? At best, he saw queerness as a psychological phase. At worst, he pathologized it into a disorder. So, yeah, the father of modern psychology had some pretty shaky ideas when it came to anyone who didn't fit his very specific mold of desire. Freud wasn't alone. Around the same time, other early sexologists were writing thick, dusty books about abnormal sexuality. Richard von Krafft-Ebing categorized countless types of sexual behavior into neat little diagnostic boxes: sadism, masochism, fetishism, inversion. His work was groundbreaking, but also deeply judgmental. These weren't identities, they were pathologies, symptoms, evidence of how far someone had strayed from the so-called norm. And what was normal, male, heterosexual, married, reproductive. Anything else was deviant by default. The effect of this medicalization was profound. Suddenly, sex wasn't just a private act, it was a subject to be diagnosed. Your fantasies could be dissected. Your preferences could land you in an institution. Your gender expression might earn you a prescription, or an electroshock. For decades, especially in Europe and the US, queer people were institutionalized, sterilized, or forced into corrective therapy, all because the experts said they were sick. There's a scholarly debate that still stings. Did these early sexologists help or hurt? On one hand, they were the first to study sexuality with something resembling curiosity, instead of outright moral condemnation. They named behaviours that had long been ignored or punished. On the other hand, they wrapped those names in layers of judgment and medical authority. And once you give something a diagnosis, it becomes something to fix. Now imagine a young woman in 1920s Berlin. She falls in love with another woman, deeply, tenderly. They write each other letters, spend nights dancing in hidden clubs. But when her family finds out, she's sent to a doctor. He tells her she's confused. He prescribes rest, cold baths, maybe even recommends institutional care. Her love isn't criminal exactly, but it's still considered an illness. Or picture a boy growing up in the 1930s America. He doesn't feel like other boys. He's soft-spoken, curious, sensitive. His parents take him to a psychologist who tells them he's showing signs of inversion, a term for homosexuality. He's told to toughen up, sent to sports, discouraged from music, from softness, from his own instincts. Slowly he learns that every part of himself must be masked. And let's not forget what happened to people whose identities didn't fit neatly into gender boxes. Trans and non-binary people didn't suddenly appear in the 21st century. They've always existed. But early psychology often treated them as anomalies or tragic mistakes. Some doctors offered hormone treatments or surgeries, but only if patients conformed to very strict narratives. You had to say you hated your body, that you were born in the wrong one, that you wanted a normal life. The path to medical care was paved with performance. This era wasn't just about individual trauma. It laid the groundwork for systems that still exist today. The idea that there's one healthy way to experience sexuality, that anything else must be corrected, studied, or shamed into silence. Even now, echoes of Freud and his peers live on in therapy offices, in diagnostic manuals, in school curriculums that skip over entire identities because they don't fit the model. And yet, despite all this, people still found ways to claim their truths. The same decades that gave us electroshock therapy also gave us underground gay bars. Queer writers coded their desires into poetry, artists painted their longings into canvases, lovers used science's own language to defend themselves, arguing that their identities were natural, not pathological. Because even when you're being dissected, you can still be defiant. So tonight, picture that quiet office, the couch, the ticking clock, the patient whispering secrets they've never said aloud, and the doctor jotting notes, interpreting symbols, convinced he's mapping the human soul, when really he's just adding another layer to the long, complicated history of trying to control what can't be cured: desire. You'd think war would kill intimacy, crush it under the weight of rations and rubble, leave it buried in trenches and bomb craters. But strangely enough, the opposite has often been true. War doesn't just disrupt economies and redraw borders, it also throws sexuality into chaos. And sometimes, that chaos is engineered. Tonight, we're stepping into the strange world of wartime intimacy, where governments handed out condoms with dog tags, produced manuals on seduction and hygiene, and even built entire institutions around controlling who got to have sex, and with whom. Start with World War I, trench warfare, mustard gas, barbed wire. You're picturing men dirty, exhausted, afraid. But back home, a different kind of campaign was running. Public health warnings about syphilis, loose women, and the moral danger of soldiers fraternizing with locals. Governments weren't just worried about bullets, they were worried about erections, or more specifically, where those erections might be directed. Here's your historical fact. During both World Wars, especially World War II, the US, Britain, Germany, and Japan all issued official guidance on sex to their troops. In the US, soldiers were given pamphlets with titles like sex hygiene and venereal disease, warning them about prostitutes and bad women, while subtly encouraging sexual restraint, as long as it didn't interfere with morale. Some countries even created comfort stations or regulated brothels near military bases. Japan's use of comfort women, a sanitized term for the systematic enslavement and rape of women from Korea, China, and other occupied territories, is one of the most horrific and still disputed war crimes of the 20th century. And your fringe fact: during World War II, the US Army secretly hired prostitutes in the Pacific to service black soldiers separately from white ones. It was a segregation of sex work, a blend of racism and military logistics that said more about America's social fears than its military needs. These sex workers were medically inspected regularly, and their work was monitored by Army officials. It wasn't hidden, it was organised. That's the uncomfortable truth here. Wartime governments didn't just tolerate sex, they tried to manage it. Not because they believed in love or even health, but because they knew that desire doesn't disappear during war. It festers. It grows in the silences between gunfire. And if you don't give soldiers a sanctioned outlet, they'll find one anyway. And that made officials nervous. So instead of trying to suppress sex, many militaries simply reframed it. Sex became a morale booster, a release valve, something to be controlled, rationed, like cigarettes or soap. And when women entered the workforce in record numbers, nurses, factory workers, clerks, suddenly, female sexuality became patriotic. Posters encouraged women to remain modest, but also charming. Keep up morale, but don't be a distraction. Be friendly, but not too friendly. Walk that impossible line. But here's the twist. Wartime intimacy wasn't just about men seeking pleasure. It was about how women too were caught in the machinery. Some volunteered, some were conscripted, and some were simply trapped. Many comfort women during World War II were abducted or coerced. Others were promised jobs as nurses or cleaners, only to find themselves imprisoned in military brothels. The trauma was systematic and widespread. For decades their stories were buried, either denied by governments or erased by post-war shame. Scholars still debate the exact number of women involved and whether some volunteered. But that question misses the point. In war, choice becomes murky. When your town has been bombed, your family killed, and a soldier shows up with a gun, the word volunteer loses its meaning. Now think about what happened to queer soldiers. In the US and Britain, homosexuality was still criminalised, and LGBTQ plus people caught in the military were discharged, punished, or forced into silence. But here's the quiet part. Same-sex intimacy did happen, often, frequently, passionately. Long deployments, shared barracks, months at sea, these created environments where bonds formed quickly and deeply. For many queer people, war was the first time they were surrounded by others who felt the same. And yes, many of these relationships were romantic. Some lasted decades, but they had to stay hidden, even as their participants risked their lives for countries that wouldn't even let them kiss in public. Picture two soldiers in North Africa, huddled in a tent during a sandstorm. One writes the other a letter before going on patrol. He hides it under his cot. It's never sent. Years later, someone finds it in a footlocker and realises that this war wasn't just about tanks and flags. It was also about the people who were never allowed to grieve out loud. And what about after the war? The flood of marriages that followed World War II wasn't just about love. It was about pressure. Veterans were expected to come home, settle down, and start families. Women who had worked in factories were pushed out of jobs and back into kitchens. Queer people who had tasted freedom in wartime had to return to closets, and those who didn't faced blackmail, arrest, or worse. This is where the scholarly debate gets tangled. Did war liberate sexuality by breaking social structures and mixing people across class and geography? Or did it reinforce control by using intimacy as just another part of the war machine? The answer, of course, is both. War makes things messy. It tears down walls and builds new ones, sometimes in the same breath. So tonight, imagine the field hospitals, the base dances, the foggy moments between sirens, the nurse and the wounded soldier who fall in love, even though they know he's shipping out again in 2 days, the GI who buys a ring for the girl who writes him every week, the interpreter who risks everything for the man who isn't even allowed to hold his hand in daylight. And also, picture the ones who didn't get a choice. The women pulled from villages, the boys who learned to fake smiles, the girls whose names were never recorded. Because in wartime, bodies become tools, desire becomes data, and love, if it survives, is forced to crawl through rubble to find a place to exist. Now the dust settles, the bombs stop falling, the parades roll through. The war is over, but the myth machine is just getting warmed up. Welcome to Hollywood's golden age, the land of dreams and devastating contracts, where the lights are bright, the studios are all powerful, and the cameras never stop rolling, even when they should. Tonight, you're walking onto a soundstage in the 1940s or 50s. The set is dressed to perfection. The leading lady is luminous. The man across from her is brooding and square-jawed. But what you won't see is what happens when the director yells, "Cut!" What you won't see is how sex, power, and silence were stitched into the very fabric of America's most glamorous export. This was the era when the movie industry perfected fantasy. Not just on the screen, but off it. Marketing not just films, but entire human beings. Stars weren't just actors. They were constructed, manufactured by studios who dictated everything from their weight to their hair colour, to who they were allowed to date in public. You didn't own your own image. Sometimes you didn't even own your name. Here's your historical fact. The Hollywood studio system from the 1920s through the early 1960s operated under the Hays Code, a strict set of moral guidelines that dictated what could and couldn't be shown on screen. No suggestive dances, no mixed-race relationships, no homosexuality, no mention of sexual perversion, no excessive kissing. These rules weren't just about shaping movies, they were about shaping culture. Sex had to be alluded to but never shown. Desire had to be punished, or at least properly married off by the third act. But behind the scenes, a very different story. Here's your fringe fact. One of the worst-kept secrets in Hollywood was the so-called casting couch. Actresses, especially young ones, often under contract with no power to say no, were routinely coerced into sex by producers, directors, and studio heads. These men weren't fringe figures. They were the architects of Hollywood's golden glow. Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM, was notorious for pressuring women during screen tests. And let's not even get started on Howard Hughes, who essentially ran a private surveillance operation on the women he obsessed over. The contracts these women signed were ironclad. They could be dropped for gaining 5 pounds, for speaking out, for refusing a role, or for not playing along with the system's unspoken rules. And if something happened to them, assault, harassment, manipulation, the The studios covered it up. They paid off newspapers, threatened careers, spun stories. A starlet caught in scandal wasn't rescued. She was blamed, often quietly exiled. Now imagine being 19, fresh off a bus from Kansas, signed to a 7-year contract. You're told you're going to be the next big thing. You're given a new name, a new wardrobe, a new smile, and then one night you're invited to dinner with an executive. You know it's not really an invitation. You also know that if you say no, your career might disappear before it starts. So you go, and you try to smile. And you wonder, later, if this is just how the dream works. It's not just women either. Queer actors were aggressively managed, forced into fake relationships for the tabloids, discouraged from any behaviour that might out them. Rock Hudson, one of the most popular leading men of the era, lived his entire public life in the closet. His studio arranged sham engagements, pressed him into silence. When he died of AIDS-related complications in 1985, the public learned the truth, but only after decades of false headlines and buried feelings. And yet, even under these restrictions, desire pulsed through the screen. The censors couldn't suppress everything. The innuendo got smarter, the tension got tighter. Some directors learned how to film kisses that meant more than kisses. Some actors learned how to act around the rules. Queer-coded characters slipped into noir films. Subtext became survival. The repression created its own language. There's still debate among film historians about how much audiences understood. Did people in the 1950s really not pick up on the chemistry between two same-sex characters? Or were they in on it, silently complicit in a cultural doublespeak? Were the actresses draped across piano bars fully understood as tragic figures, or just misunderstood icons of glamour? And let's not forget the carefully constructed images of virgin starlets like Doris Day, or the hypersexualized roles forced onto actresses like Marilyn Monroe. Monroe's real life was one long contradiction, sexual symbol to the world, vulnerable and manipulated behind closed doors. She once said, "If you're not a sex object, you're in trouble." And that's the core of the system. Women were packaged as desire itself, but punished if they expressed any of their own. So where does that leave the viewer? Sitting in the dark, popcorn in hand, watching dreams that were built on the wreckage of real people's autonomy. Even now, the nostalgia lingers. We rewatch the classics, admire the gowns, quote the lines. But do we remember the women forced to smile through things they never agreed to? Do we think about the queer actors who had to play straight while erasing themselves to keep a job? Hollywood's golden age was golden only in its surface shimmer. Underneath, it was a maze of manipulation, silence, and carefully managed illusion. And the worst part? We bought it. We still buy it. Because fantasy is easy to digest. The truth? Not so much. So tonight, imagine the lock gates closing, the cameras turning off, the actress removing her makeup in a cold dressing room alone, the man wiping his mouth after yet another studio-ordered denial, the agent whispering, "Just don't cause trouble." And picture all the people who never made it to the credits, because they said no, because they didn't fit the mould, because they wanted to own their bodies, not sell them for screen time. Because behind every big dream in Hollywood, there's always someone quietly enduring the nightmare. Pull back the curtain of old Hollywood and step into the fluorescent lit hallways of hospitals, clinics, and clean white rooms. Welcome to the age when desire didn't just get judged. It got diagnosed, charted, prescribed, and sometimes cut right out. This is the medicalization of sex, a quiet yet insidious chapter where pleasure turned into pathology, where anything outside the narrow band of normal got stamped with a disorder code, and where some of the most uncomfortable sexual truths were written in the language of science, then sold with a prescription label. By the mid-20th century, medicine had fully taken over where morality and religion had once ruled. It wasn't enough for society to shame you. Now, your doctor could tell you were broken, didn't want sex, diagnosis, wanted too much sex, also diagnosis, wanted sex in a way someone else found unusual. Well then, time to put your name in a medical file and maybe recommend a little institutional rest. Here's your historical fact. In the American Psychiatric Association's first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, published in 1952, homosexuality was officially listed as a sociopathic personality disturbance. That wasn't fringe, that was the standard. Until 1973, being gay wasn't just socially stigmatized, it was literally considered a disease. Therapies ranged from talk sessions to electric shocks to chemical castration. Some were voluntary, many were not. And this was happening in living memory. Not ancient history, your grandparents' generation. Now for your fringe fact. In the 1960s, researchers at institutions like Johns Hopkins and other major universities conducted conversion therapy experiments on kids, often without proper consent. Some were subjected to surveillance, forced gender roles, and even hormone manipulation. One case, involving a boy named David Reimer, who was raised as a girl after a botched circumcision, became a tragic example of the harm done when gender and sexuality are treated like puzzles to be solved rather than identities to be lived. His story was held up as proof that nurture could override nature, until it wasn't. David took his own life in 2004. That's the kind of damage this era left behind. It told people they were sick when they were simply different, and it made a lot of people, doctors, pharmaceutical companies, clinics, very rich in the process. Women were hit especially hard. Remember hysteria? That didn't vanish with the Victorians, it just changed costume. Mid-century medicine told women their sexual dissatisfaction was due to frigidity or neuroticism. It wasn't about the lack of communication or terrible husbands. It was their own fault for not responding correctly. Some were prescribed barbiturates to numb the anxiety. Others were referred to psychiatric institutions, and if a woman dared to say she enjoyed sex too much. Then came the whispers of nymphomania, a term that was rarely used for men, by the way, because men being sexual was normal. Women being sexual was a condition. Meanwhile, the birth control pill was introduced in 1960, not out of some utopian vision of female freedom, but largely to control population growth and regulate women's bodies. Early versions of the pill had dangerously high hormone levels, caused severe side effects, and were tested on poor Puerto Rican women in clinical trials with little transparency. Yes, the pill became a symbol of liberation, but not before it was also a tool of medical control. This is where the debate starts to simmer. Was the medicalization of sex a necessary step toward understanding human complexity? Or was it just a new form of social policing dressed in lab coats and academic language? Some scholars argue that the science helped break down taboos and forced the conversation out of churches and into clinics. Others say it simply swapped shame for diagnosis. The message stayed the same. You are not okay. You need fixing. Even sexual pleasure itself got pathologized. If you had unusual kinks or fetishes, you could be diagnosed with paraphilia, BDSM, a mental disorder until very recently, exhibitionism, deviance, voyeurism, perversion. And again, the definition of normal was shaped almost entirely by straight white men in medical institutions. If it scared them, it got classified. And yet, amid all this control, real people still found each other. Despite the diagnoses, the pamphlets, the pills, there were still secret clubs, whispered phone numbers, handwritten letters. The medical world might have tried to regulate desire, but it couldn't kill it. In fact, sometimes the scrutiny just sharpened the hunger. Like desire was saying, "Test me all you want. I'm not going anywhere." Imagine a woman in 1971 sitting in a doctor's office because her husband told her she was frigid. She's had no say in when, how, or whether they have sex. She's never been asked what she wants. And now a man in a white coat is telling her to take pills and smile more. Or a teenage boy in 1963 sent to a psychiatrist because his parents found a magazine under his bed. He's scared, ashamed, but mostly confused. The doctor doesn't ask him what he feels. He tells him what he should feel. And if he doesn't comply, there's always shock therapy. Or think of the housewife given Valium because she's nervous, even though what she's actually feeling is resentment, boredom, and a quiet, burning desire for something more. The medicine won't give her answers, but it will keep her too drowsy to ask the questions. And all the while, under fluorescent lights, the systems hum. Intake forms, charts, diagnoses, the machinery of regulation spinning steadily, dressed as care. But there were cracks. In the 60s and 70s, activists began to fight back. LGBTQ+ rights groups challenged psychiatric classifications. Feminists demanded that women's pleasure be taken seriously. Sex researchers like Alfred Kinsey and later Masters and Johnson started gathering data that told a different story. That variation was normal. That desire wasn't a disease. That maybe, just maybe, pleasure didn't need a prescription. So tonight, Imagine a clinic bathed in sterile white light, a clipboard on the desk, a question hanging in the air. What brings you in today? And someone answering quietly, I just want to feel okay being me. Because when desire becomes something you have to prove you deserve, the harm isn't just clinical, it's personal, it's generational, and it leaves behind not just scars but silence. Let's turn now to empire. Not the kind on movie posters or coinage, but the kind that seeps into every part of a culture until it rewrites the rules for who gets to love whom and how. Tonight, we're stepping into the uncomfortable history of colonialism, and how sex was used not just as a consequence of conquest, but as one of its most effective weapons. Because when one society decides to dominate another, it rarely stops at land. It invades bodies too. It redraws borders inside people's skin, rebrands desire, rewrites what's acceptable, and punishes what isn't. Colonialism didn't just come with guns and treaties, it came with missionaries, moral codes, and endless manuals on civilized behaviour. And right near the top of that list? Sexual norms. Who could marry? Who could touch? Who was allowed to express desire? The empires, British, French, Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, didn't just rule land, they ruled gender roles. They ruled what love looked like. They planted shame like a crop and harvested obedience. Here's your historical fact. Under British rule, the legal code known as Section 377 was imposed across many colonies, criminalising carnal intercourse against the order of nature. It was a vague, sweeping law that essentially outlawed homosexuality, and it stuck. Long after independence, countries like India, Malaysia and Kenya kept these colonial laws on the books. India only repealed Section 377 in 2018. That's not an ancient problem, that's yesterday. Now your fringe fact. In French-colonised Algeria during the 19th century, colonial officers kept extensive ethnographic records of North African sexuality, often describing Arab and Berber men's relationships with younger males. But instead of respecting those practices as part of local culture, French authorities used them to justify their own dominance, framing the colonised as perverse, uncivilised, and therefore in need of control. Meanwhile, some European officers engaged in those same practices privately, while publicly condemning them. The hypocrisy wasn't a glitch. It was the whole programme. This is the cruelty of colonial intimacy. Empires often use sexual norms as proof of superiority. They called indigenous practices primitive, immoral, or animalistic. They criminalised same-sex love, polygamy, gender fluidity, things that had existed in those cultures long before Europeans arrived. And in doing so, they didn't just suppress people, they erased entire ways of loving. Take Africa. Pre-colonial societies had complex, nuanced systems of marriage and identity. Some included third genders, some recognised non-monogamous unions, some didn't obsess over virginity the way Europeans did. But with colonisation came a new rulebook. Christian missionaries burned traditional shrines and replaced them with churches. Education systems taught that proper love was heterosexual, monogamous, and modest. And any deviation, sin, deviance, punishable by law or exile. Or look at the Pacific Islands. Before Western contact, cultures like Samoa and Tonga recognised Fa'afafine, people assigned male at birth who took on feminine gender roles, often accepted and even respected within their communities. But colonisers labelled them as degenerates. Their existence became criminalised or ridiculed, and suddenly, identities that had once been celebrated had to go underground to survive. And then there's the messier side, the colonisers' own behaviour. While imposing strict sexual rules, they also exploited colonised bodies, especially women. In every colony, from India to the Congo, soldiers and settlers assaulted local women with impunity. Sexual violence wasn't just overlooked, it was often part of the strategy. Dehumanise, humiliate, breed fear. Mixed-race children, born from these encounters, were frequently ostracised, denied legal recognition, or turned into propaganda. Their very existence became political. Some colonial administrations even regulated brothels specifically for white men, ensuring they had safe outlets for their urges, while discouraging interracial relationships. Unless those relationships reinforced white dominance, a black or brown woman as a mistress, tolerated as a wife, scandalous. There were entire policies written to prevent that kind of equality from taking root, because love across racial lines threatened the entire hierarchy. Now here's the scholarly debate. Was sexual control an intentional tool of empire, or just an inevitable byproduct of domination? Some argue that empires didn't care about people's private lives unless it got in the way of governance. Others say that policing sexuality was part of the whole colonial project, because by regulating the most intimate parts of life, the colonizers could shape not just behaviour, but identity. And when you control identity, you control resistance. Because that's the thing. You can't conquer a people fully until you convince them that even their desires are wrong. Imagine a young woman in 1930s Kenya, raised in a traditional Kikuyu family. She's told by missionaries that her initiation rites are barbaric, that her body is shameful, that her only salvation lies in marrying a Christian man and covering her head. Her family is torn between tradition and the new rules. She loses both in the process. Or a young boy in 1950s Malaysia who feels drawn to another boy in school. He hides it, fearing the laws passed down from British rule. He grows up believing there's something criminal about the way he feels, and even when independence comes, the shame remains, wrapped in a colonial flag long gone but never fully folded away. Or think of an indigenous couple in Canada, separated by a residential school system that forcibly removed children from their families and punished them for speaking their language, for expressing their culture, for showing affection in ways not deemed acceptable. That's not just cultural genocide, that's sexual colonization. Intimacy ripped apart in the name of civilization. And yet, resistance bloomed. People remembered. Stories were whispered. Love survived in secret. In the 80s and 90s, activists across the global south began calling out these inherited laws. They said, this isn't us. This isn't ours. They traced the roots of their oppression back to empire and started pulling them up, one law at a time. Decriminalization, reclamation, revival of ancient traditions that honoured gender fluidity and non-monogamy. A quiet revolution in bedrooms, courts and classrooms. So tonight, as the air cools and your room goes still, think about how empires didn't just want land. They wanted the power to define love. And how the most radical act sometimes is to remember who you were before someone told you to be ashamed of it. Because they could take your gold, your language, your gods, but if they could take your desire, then they'd taken something even deeper. Now we hit the point in history when the doors blow open, just for a moment. A brief, dizzying, euphoric blur between the rigid past and the reactionary future. Welcome to the sexual revolution. It's the late 1960s into the 70s. The clothes are getting tighter, the hair longer, the music louder, and all across America and parts of Europe, the youth are standing up, throwing off the rules and saying, we want to feel something, and we want to feel it now. This wasn't just a cultural shift, it was a tectonic one. After centuries of tight-laced moral policing, suddenly, people were talking openly, loudly, about sex. Books like The Joy of Sex were flying off shelves. College campuses were thick with protest signs and patchouli, and somewhere between the feminist movement, civil rights marches and Vietnam backlash, the body became political again. But not in the old way, not just as something to be controlled. It became something to liberate. Here's your historical fact. In 1960, the FDA approved the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, kicking off what many call the true beginning of the sexual revolution. Suddenly, for the first time in history, millions of women had access to reliable, discreet birth control. It gave them control over their reproductive lives, which in turn gave them more freedom in relationships, education, and the workplace. It wasn't magic. It came with side effects, political pushback, and controversy. But it was a catalyst. The pill didn't just prevent pregnancy. It cracked open an entire cultural conversation about who sex was for. And now for your fringe fact. In the early 70s, a small, almost comically radical movement began pushing the idea of free love communes, where people lived together without the bounds of monogamy, marriage, or traditional family roles. One of the most famous was Carista Commune in San Francisco. Members practiced what they called polyfidelity, closed group relationships with rotating sleeping schedules and endless discussion circles. They wore matching outfits, raised children communally, and believed sexual jealousy could be unlearned through utopian discipline. It didn't last, of course, but for a moment they weren't alone. Whole collectives sprung up trying to rewrite what love and sex could look like without ownership. The 1970s exploded with experimentation. Nudity hit Broadway. Porn hit the big screen. deep throats sold tickets like a Marvel movie. The gay rights movement roared into public consciousness, especially after the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City, where queer patrons, tired of police raids and shame, fought back. Pride was born in protest, and for a few wild years, it really did feel like the rules were melting, but of course, freedom came with friction. The conservative backlash was already building, coiled like a spring. For every student burning their bra, there was a politician sharpening their rhetoric. The newly vocal religious right began framing sexual liberation as moral decay. Books were banned, clinics were protested, sex educators were smeared as corrupting the youth. The revolution was real, but it was also always under siege. And here's the heart of the scholarly debate. Did the sexual revolution truly liberate people, or did it just replace old pressures with new ones? Some feminists argued that liberation was still playing by men's rules, only now women were expected to say yes instead of being allowed to say no. Consent got blurred in the name of freedom. Sex became a kind of social currency, and if you weren't free enough, you were still shamed, just from the other direction. Think of a college girl in 1974. She's on a campus buzzing with sex-positive messaging, group discussions, maybe even co-ed dorms. She's told she can do anything now, sleep with who she wants, no strings, no shame. But what if she wants love? What if she says no and someone calls her uptight? She's still trapped, just in a new kind of box. Or picture a gay man walking into his first bathhouse in 1978. It's electric, exhilarating, filled with bodies and possibility. He's never felt more alive, but also part of him is still braced for danger. A police raid, a slur, a punch in the parking lot. Freedom was intoxicating, but fragile. And in the background, the porn industry is booming. Not the soft-focused stuff your aunt secretly watched, but hardcore, money-hungry, misogynistic scripts, shot with no unions, no protections, and very little ethics. Some people called it empowering. Others saw women chewed up and discarded. And the debate still rages. Does filming desire set it free, or does it commercialize it into something hollow? Even the most personal acts became public battlegrounds. Masturbation, once a whisper topic, was suddenly a rallying cry. Feminist pioneers like Betty Dodson hosted body sex workshops, where women were encouraged to look at their genitals with mirrors and reclaim pleasure from a lifetime of repression. It was radical, awkward, and for many, completely life-changing. But the revolution couldn't protect everyone. Sex workers were still criminalized. People of color were largely excluded from the mainstream liberation narrative, even though their communities had long histories of fighting sexual control, especially black activists who called out the legacy of exploitation and reproductive violence. Trans people too were often sidelined, celebrated only when they passed, or stayed quiet about the parts of their identities that made the public uncomfortable. And then, just as the decade turned, the storm rolled in. A mysterious illness started creeping through queer communities, ignored by media and government alike. By the time it had a name, AIDS, it had already killed thousands. The sexual revolution didn't end with fireworks, it ended with funerals, and suddenly everything changed again. But that comes next. For now, picture a protest in 1975. Homemade signs, wide-leg jeans, music in the air. A woman shouts into a megaphone about bodily autonomy. A man in a pink triangle pin kisses his boyfriend in the street. A couple dances barefoot at a commune, believing they've found utopia. Somewhere else, a girl stares at a mirror in a candlelit room, alone, and finally feels like her body is hers. Because for one wild moment, sex wasn't something to fear, it was something to fight for. The music fades, the disco ball slows its spin. What was once freedom begins to feel like fallout. It's the early 1980s, and something invisible is creeping through bodies, slipping past kisses and blood transfusions and whispered nights. First, it has no name. Then it has too many: GRID, gay cancer, the 4-H disease. And finally, it has one that sticks: AIDS. Tonight, you're walking into the darkest shadow cast by the sexual revolution, a crisis so deeply wrapped in fear, silence, and stigma that entire governments hesitated to say its name. But the people who lived it, they screamed it. This isn't just a chapter in medical history, it's a chapter in desire, a brutal reckoning with how society treats bodies it never fully cared to understand. The AIDS crisis wasn't just a pandemic, It was a mirror, and what it showed wasn't just death, it was who got to be grieved and who didn't. Here's your historical fact. The first official report on what would become known as AIDS was published by the CDC in 1981, documenting a strange pneumonia affecting 5 gay men in Los Angeles. Within a few years, tens of thousands of people were infected. By the end of the decade, AIDS had become the leading cause of death for American men ages 25 to 44. But despite this, the Reagan administration didn't publicly acknowledge the epidemic until 1985, and even then it was barely a whisper. And now for your fringe fact. In San Francisco, before the outbreak became a national headline, there were underground T-cell parties. Some men would gather, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes not, in shared spaces of denial and defiance. In the absence of clear science and reliable support, rumours grew fast. Some believed that once you were infected there was no point in avoiding exposure again. Some thought repeated contact could boost immunity. It wasn't widespread, but it happened. That's what terror and isolation do. They twist logic. They make myths feel safer than reality. At the heart of the crisis was a truth too ugly for mainstream society to face. The people dying were mostly queer men, IV drug users, sex workers, those already pushed to the margins, which meant for many they were seen as disposable, or worse, as deserving. Churches called it divine punishment. Politicians ignored it. Comedians made jokes. And while bodies wasted away, hospitals turned patients away. Families disowned sons. Funeral homes refused services. And if someone dared to mourn too loudly, they were accused of spreading hysteria. Imagine a man in 1983, 30 years old. He's lost 2 friends already. One more's in the hospital. He goes to the mirror every morning and checks his lymph nodes. He stops having sex. Or he doesn't. Because when everything feels fatal, sometimes pleasure is all you have left. But the guilt claws at him anyway. The fear becomes a second skin. Or picture a nurse, one of the few who doesn't flinch at lesions or pull away from thin arms. She wipes the sweat, holds the hands, listens to confessions from men whose parents won't visit. She knows the truth. This isn't just a virus. It's a political disaster. And for every horror, there's resistance. The AIDS crisis gave rise to one of the most powerful activist movements in modern history. Groups like ACT UP and the Gay Men's Health Crisis demanded attention, funding and compassion. They staged die-ins at government buildings. They interrupted news broadcasts. They covered public spaces with posters that read, "Silence equals death," because it did. Scholars still argue about the cultural impact of the epidemic. Some see it as a tragic backslide after the liberation of the 70s, a return to fear, shame and chastity. Others see it as a crucible, where a generation of queer people forged a new kind of strength, unapologetic, angry, visible. Either way, the legacy is etched in both tombstones and policy. The fear spread fast. Suddenly, sex was deadly again. Public service announcements returned like old ghosts, this time with latex gloves and stern-faced doctors. Condoms became a symbol of survival. Gay bars dimmed. Bathhouses closed. Casual sex, once celebrated, became loaded with risk. And yet, desire didn't disappear. It just adapted. Some people stopped touching altogether. Others leaned into intimacy more fiercely than ever. Partners learned to care for each other in ways doctors wouldn't. Long-term lovers became nurses, advocates, next of kin. Funerals turned into protests. Wakes became fundraisers. Death made love louder. And still, the stigma endured. Women with AIDS were often overlooked in research and care. Black and brown communities were disproportionately affected but rarely centred in public awareness. The early narrative, white, urban, male, left out thousands. And what about those who watched it from the sidelines? The straight public, the safe ones. They were told to use condoms, avoid sharing needles, and just say no. But very few were told the truth, that this crisis wasn't just a medical failure, it was a cultural indictment of homophobia, of classism, of how easily people turn away from suffering when it doesn't fit the script. By the late 90s, antiretroviral therapy had turned AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable condition, at least for those with access. But the damage was already done. An entire generation lost. Lovers gone. Artists, dancers, teachers, activists, wiped out before the world could see what they might have become. Tonight, picture the candlelight vigils, the quilts stitched with names and grief, The men sitting on stoops in Chelsea or the Castro, watching the world go on without the ones they loved. And the women who buried friends, the nurses who burned out, the scientists who worked around the clock while politicians posed, and maybe, just maybe, picture one man sitting quietly with another. No sex, just presence. Just someone who says, "I see you." Because in the middle of that epidemic, when the world made desire feel like death, love didn't leave. It stayed. Because even when the body betrays, the heart can still hold on. As the 1990s unfolded, the world started pretending it had finally matured. The Cold War thawed, technology raced forward, and everything came wrapped in the shiny optimism of a Windows 95 screensaver. It was the age of cable TV and dial-up internet, boy bands and pop feminism. A weird middle ground where society declared, "We're open-minded now," while still clutching pearls at anything too honest. Sex, in this era, didn't disappear. It just got rebranded, commercialized, sanitized, mass-produced. Tonight we're walking through the mall of mid to late 20th century sexual culture, where everything was for sale, but the fine print always left something out. Here's your historical fact. In 1998, Viagra was approved by the FDA and quickly became one of the fastest-selling drugs in history. Overnight, it turned male sexual dysfunction into $1 billion business. No longer did men have to suffer the indignity of getting older. They could take a little blue pill and return to form. Newspapers ran headlines calling it a revolution. Celebrities made jokes. Even Bob Dole did a commercial. But the sudden cultural comfort with talking about men's pleasure didn't exactly extend to everyone else. Female desire, still complicated, still too much or not enough, still mostly unspoken. Which brings us to your fringe fact. In 1995, a Canadian doctor developed a prototype for a female condom, not the kind marketed by public health clinics, but an internal device made for pleasure, not just prevention. It worked, too. The catch? Nobody wanted to fund it. Pharmaceutical companies called it too niche, too complicated, or unmarketable. What they meant was, women's pleasure doesn't sell unless it's selling something else. And that's the thread that runs through the 90s and early 2000s. Sex was everywhere, on magazine covers, in MTV videos, wrapped around soda cans, but it was rarely about actual connection or curiosity. Instead, it became part of a marketing strategy. You didn't just buy jeans, you bought the idea that someone would want to rip them off you. You didn't drink a beer, you consumed a fantasy of bikinis and breathy voiceovers. Desire became branding. Think about the rise of the Lad Mag, Maxim, FHM stuff. Glossy pages filled with hot lists and articles about how to get the girl. These magazines were the evolution of Playboy without the pretense of sophistication. They sold the idea that being a man meant pursuing sex relentlessly, while being a woman meant being a prize, a pose, a rating out of 10. For many young readers, these became their first sex education. And what about women's magazines? They offered their own brand of confusion. Cosmo promised 10 ways to drive him wild, but rarely mentioned what you might actually want. There were pages about boosting your confidence, but only if it resulted in someone else's approval. And when the infamous female Viagra, Addy, was released years later, it came with a pile of restrictions, warnings and side effects, and none of the marketing bravado that men got. Because by then, female desire had been so endlessly medicalized, monetized, and misunderstood, no one knew how to just ask women what they wanted anymore. Now enter the internet, slow at first, then faster, then everywhere. In the late 90s, porn went from being behind store counters and red-curtained booths to living right in your browser. Suddenly, desire was infinite. Whatever your kink, curiosity or craving, there was a site for it. But with that access came distortion. Porn wasn't new, but the speed and scale of it was. Millions of images, most algorithm-fed, shaped by what sold the best, not what reflected real pleasure. And here's where the scholarly debate hits a boiling point. Did this explosion of access lead to a more informed, accepting culture? Or did it just make sex more performative, more transactional, more detached from real emotion? Some argue that internet porn opened up space for exploration, especially for people who felt excluded from mainstream narratives. Others point out how it fed unrealistic expectations, rewired brains, and treated consent like a scene transition. And all the while, sex education in schools remained dismal. Abstinence-only programs peaked in the early 2000s, funded heavily by federal dollars in the US, despite mountains of evidence that they didn't work. Kids were told, just say no, while the internet screamed, just click here. And in that gap, confusion bloomed. A generation grew up with access to more sexual content than any before, but almost no guidance on how to navigate it. Imagine a teenage girl in 1999, reading magazines telling her to be sexy, but not too sexy. Watching movies where women climaxed from 2 seconds of intercourse, then walked off camera smiling. Her questions go unanswered. Her curiosity feels dangerous. She types into Ask Jeeves, then deletes the history in a panic. Or a boy in 2002, raised on a mix of hyper-masculine ads and pixelated porn, trying to piece together what intimacy is supposed to look like. No one teaches him about communication or emotion. He learns choreography instead. Moves, not meaning. And in the corner of all this, queer kids are quietly Googling phrases they're too scared to say out loud. Forums become lifelines, chat rooms become confessions, the internet becomes a closet and also a window. Even the way we talked about sex got skewed. Words like empowerment and choice were thrown around constantly, but always within a capitalist frame. Buy this lingerie, get this surgery, read this article, your liberation is waiting, just enter your credit card. So what happens when sex becomes product? When desire is a line item on a marketing pitch? You start to lose the nuance. You start to forget that real intimacy is awkward and surprising and sometimes wordless. You trade the messy human parts for filters and punchlines. And still, in the middle of all that noise, people tried to connect. Some did. Some fell in love in AOL chat rooms. Some explored their identities in live journal confessionals. Some found community in web forums that understood what their hometowns didn't. That matters. So tonight, picture a bedroom glowing with the light of a computer monitor. Someone typing, "Am I normal?" into an early search engine. Someone else deleting a chat log before their mum walks in. A couple trying to mimic what they saw in a movie and then laughing when it feels nothing like that. A kid clicking on something they don't understand yet, but knowing it stirs something real. Because even in the age of algorithms, behind all the pop-up ads and marketing gloss, the same old truth held, people want to feel close. People want to be seen. People want more than just what's for sale. By the time the 2010s roll in, the world is carrying the weight of 1 million whispered conversations, some recorded, some erased, most never resolved. But now, everything is online, everything is tracked, and everything can go viral. Tonight, you're stepping into the digital labyrinth of modern sexuality, where liberation comes with likes, shame trends by the hour, and everyone's expected to be sex positive but also scandal proof. This is the era where saying "I like this" can make you famous, or get you fired, where one swipe can spark a date, a ghosting, a hookup, or a headline. Welcome to the age of contradictions. Let's start with your historical fact. In 2017, the Me Too movement erupted globally after years of slow building pressure. What began as a grassroots campaign founded by Tarana Burke in 2006 suddenly exploded into the mainstream after high-profile stories of sexual abuse in Hollywood broke wide open. But this wasn't just about celebrities. It triggered a reckoning across industries and communities, forcing conversations about consent, power, and the blurred lines that too many people had pretended didn't exist. For the first time in modern memory, survivors weren't just heard, they were believed, and their words carried consequences. But as with all things in this space, the backlash came fast and sharp. Some accused the movement of overreach, others mocked it as prudish or humorless. A few powerful men cried witch hunt while quietly cashing out. And yet, something had shifted. Consent, once assumed or avoided, was now at the centre of the conversation. Here's your fringe fact. In 2014, a Swedish company released a prototype for a consent app, where two people could digitally agree to sex before it happened. It was clunky, poorly received, and mostly seen as satire, but it reflected a larger anxiety. People weren't just confused about what was okay, they were scared. Scared of doing the wrong thing, scared of being accused, scared of the grey areas that no app could ever really navigate. Because human connection isn't made of contracts, it's messy, nuanced, filled with silence and tone and timing. But in the digital era, everyone wanted a receipt. Which brings us to dating apps. The pixelated jungle where modern love lives, dies, and occasionally texts back. Tinder, launched in 2012, gamified attraction. Swipe right for yes, left for no, and suddenly people were judging each other faster than ever before. Other apps followed: Grindr, Bumble, Hinge, Her. Each offered a slightly different vibe, but the premise was the same. Choose who you want based on a photo and a bio and hope for a spark. It was efficient, exciting, and deeply surreal. Suddenly, people had more access to potential partners than at any point in human history. But more choice didn't mean more connection. Often, it meant more exhaustion. Ghosting became normal, emotional investment got risky, and many users found themselves trapped in a cycle of endless scrolling, always looking for someone better, someone hotter, more clever, more available, more whatever. Meanwhile, the language around sexuality grew rapidly more complex and more visible. Terms like asexual, demisexual, pansexual, aromantic, greysexual began entering mainstream vocabulary. For many, it was a relief to find words that fit, a sense of recognition, of community. But for others, it became overwhelming, like the rules were constantly shifting, and you could never keep up. Old jokes didn't land anymore. Flirting became a risk. Saying the wrong thing, even without malice, could mean online shame or worse. This is the paradox of modern sexual discourse. We say we're more open, more evolved, more inclusive, and in many ways, we are. But we're also more afraid, more performative, caught between wanting to be authentic and fearing how it might be received. Now consider the hyper-visibility of sex in the social media age. Bodies curated for Instagram, captions dripping with self-love, and hashtags about empowerment. But behind the filters, it's hard to tell where confidence ends and capitalism begins. You post a photo because you feel hot, but also because you know it'll get likes. You talk about boundaries in your caption, but also sell a product in the same breath. Sex positivity became a brand. Feminism became a hoodie slogan. Kink became TikTok content. And while it opened doors for dialogue and destigmatization, it also made desire complicated. What's real? What's curated? Who's in control? Imagine a young woman in 2018 raised on body positivity and empowerment messaging. She wants to explore her sexuality, but also fears judgment. She wants to set boundaries, but feels guilty doing so. Every decision is weighed against how it might look, on social media, in group chats, in someone else's story later. Even her private life feels public. Or think of a queer teenager in 2020, who finally finds language that makes sense, maybe non-binary, maybe asexual, maybe biromantic grey ace, and wants to come out. But now it feels like there's pressure to be a perfect representation of that label, to be visible, but not too much, to educate others, but never seem annoyed. Identity becomes performance. Again, even porn changed shape. OnlyFans and other platforms flipped the script, letting performers reclaim some control and profit. Sex workers built followings, engaged directly with fans, and created a space where consent and control were finally in the hands of the people on screen. But with that came new threats: banking restrictions, censorship laws, internet purges that punish sexual content under the guise of safety. And here's the debate that still rages. Have we reached a new era of sexual freedom, or just a new kind of entrapment? We have more vocabulary, more representation, more public support than ever, but also more anxiety, more burnout, more questions than answers. Because under all the apps and activism and avatars, the core problem remains: humans are complex, desire is messy, and our systems, legal, digital, economic, still don't know what to do with that. So tonight, picture a phone glowing in the dark, a message being typed and deleted, a profile being swiped, a group chat analysing every emoji. Picture someone staring at their own selfie, wondering if they look confident enough, empowered enough, sexy and safe, and then picture someone else logging off, taking a breath, and finally asking, not their followers, but themselves, what do I actually want? Because until we answer that, all the noise is just that. Noise. And now here we are, on the trembling edge of the present, where everything feels both wildly progressive and somehow more fragile than ever. Sex is no longer just an act, or even just an identity. It's a headline, a political battleground, a brand strategy, a breaking news notification. It's weaponized, monetized, medicalized, and debated across every platform with equal parts rage, irony, and exhaustion. Welcome to Right Now, where you're expected to know all the right words, feel all the right things, and never ever mess up. Tonight, you're standing in the centre of the storm trying to figure out if sexual truth still means anything, or if it's just another trend we've already scrolled past. Let's start with your historical fact. In 2022, the US Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, ending nearly 50 years of federal protection for abortion rights. It was a seismic shift, one that sent shockwaves not only through reproductive healthcare, but through every conversation about autonomy, consent, and control. The ruling didn't just affect those seeking abortions, it created a chilling effect around bodily freedom in general. States moved quickly to restrict not just procedures, but even information, language, and digital data. People started deleting period tracking apps. Doctors hesitated to offer care. And suddenly, sex had consequences again. But only for some. Now your fringe fact. In 2023, a conservative state legislature proposed a bill that would criminalise the sale of sex toys on Sundays, citing family values. Yes, that happened. In a year where AI was writing books and billionaires were launching rockets, someone thought a vibrator was the problem. The legislation didn't pass, but the fact that it was even drafted speaks volumes. We live in a world of astonishing technological power, but we still panic over pleasure, or at least over who gets to access it. Because that's what the current battleground really is. Not just sex, but ownership. Who owns your body? Who decides how you use it? Can you share it, sell it, change it, celebrate it, and still be considered acceptable? For trans people, the answer is often no. Even as visibility has grown, rights have been viciously attacked. Laws have been passed limiting access to gender-affirming care, banning trans athletes, criminalising drag performances under the false banner of protecting children. The language around these policies is always the same: fear, protection, tradition. But beneath it all is a profound discomfort with the idea that people can own their identities without asking permission. Trans bodies make society confront its false binaries, and for some, that's more threatening than any actual danger. And then there's sex work, still demonised, still criminalised, despite the fact that the internet has made it more visible, more professional, and in some cases more consensual than ever before. Platforms like OnlyFans blurred the line between creator and consumer, between intimacy and entertainment, and the moment it became profitable for the workers, banks pulled funding, legislators cracked down, payment processors started ghosting accounts. The moment marginalised people, especially women, especially queer people, found a way to make money from their own sexuality on their own terms, the system turned on them, so we're back in the familiar loop. Visibility met with punishment, progress followed by backlash. The truth is, every generation thinks it's the first to discover sexual discomfort. But the more you zoom out, the more you see the pattern. Desire is pleased when it threatens power. Always has been. Probably always will be. And now the technology has made it more complicated. Deepfake porn, AI-generated fake explicit videos of real people, is on the rise and almost entirely used against women. It's non-consensual, impossible to contain, and fully legal in most places. Your face, your voice, your likeness, no longer yours. This isn't the future, this is the present, and it's horrifying. At the same time, digital intimacy is exploding. Virtual sex, erotic AI chatbots, long-distance relationships facilitated through headsets and Bluetooth toys. For some, it's liberating. For others, isolating. Is it real connection, or just high-tech loneliness? The answer depends on who's asking. Here's the current scholarly debate. Are we finally approaching true sexual liberation, or have we just flattened everything into content? Is identity being explored more deeply, or just packaged more neatly? Are we building a better, freer world, or just dressing up the same old systems in cooler fonts? Picture a 17-year-old today. They have access to more sexual language, content, and community than anyone before them. They can find out who they are, connect with others, learn from hundreds of sources, but they're also bombarded with impossible standards. They're tracked, judged, screenshot, cancelled. They're told to be authentic while constantly being watched. Is that freedom? Or is it just surveillance with a rainbow filter? Or picture a middle-aged woman, post-divorce, exploring dating apps for the first time. She's told she should feel empowered. She's told this is her time. But the algorithms push younger bodies to the top. She's fetishized or ignored. She starts to wonder if this so-called revolution has any room for her at all. Or imagine a trans man trying to get hormone therapy in a state that's just banned it. He has to drive hundreds of miles, dodge protests, navigate insurance nightmares, all for the right to feel like himself in his own skin. This isn't liberation. This is a test of endurance. And yet, people keep fighting, protesting, creating, laughing even. Sex educators are building better curriculums. Therapists are rewriting their textbooks. Young people are unlearning shame faster than it can be taught. Communities are protecting each other when the system won't. Because no matter how many times the pendulum swings backward, desire refuses to be buried. So tonight, take a breath. Think about the long road you've just walked, through empires and clinics, through protests and pandemics, through filters and fears. Think about all the people who were punished for wanting, for loving, for refusing to apologize. And then think about the ones still fighting now, not for a perfect world, but for a world where nobody has to earn the right to be human. Because at the core of it all, the history, the control, the discomfort, is one truth so simple it almost feels radical. Your body is yours. And now, with the lights low and your mind still buzzing, let's pull back, way back. You've made it through a journey that spanned empires, bedrooms, courtrooms, and cell phone screens. You've watched as entire civilizations try to tame something as personal and as powerful as desire. You've seen what happens when sex is exalted, when it's condemned, when it's sold, and when it's feared. You've heard the stories of those who are punished for feeling too much or too little or just differently. And maybe you've seen echoes of your own story in theirs. Because if there's one thing all of this proves, it's that sex has never just been about sex. It's been about power, about survival, about identity, legacy, hope, and sometimes just a way to feel alive when everything else is falling apart. The uncomfortable truth? We've never really been free with it. Not completely. Every gain has come with resistance. Every openness with a shadow. Every liberation with a leash just out of frame. And yet, through all the history, the shame campaigns, the euphemisms and fear tactics, something tender has endured. People still fall in love. People still make each other laugh in bed. People still write poems about someone's freckles. Someone, somewhere, still leans in for a first kiss with a racing heart and trembling fingers. We are strange, flawed, and desperate to be known. But through all the discomfort, we keep trying. So maybe that's the final truth. Not that sex ever becomes simple, but that it's worth wrestling with, worth talking about, worth holding gently in both hands, even when it's heavy. Now, close your eyes. Let the weight of history settle down and drift away, like old dust in sunlight. The past is behind us, but its lessons are stitched into our skin. The future? Still messy, still unwritten, but yours to shape, inch by inch, breath by breath, with whatever tenderness or fire you choose to bring. Thanks for walking through it all with me.